Catching criminals is no easy job.
Raping is arrest you.
But it's even harder when the criminal is a cop turned bad.
He liked having power and authority and status and a uniform.
When the police officers who were sworn to protect us turned to rape,
she was actually meeting a monster.
Murder.
What happened in those minutes or moments or seconds where he chose to go and get a weapon?
Robbery.
He knows where the money is, he knows where the drugs are.
And even blackmail and poisoning. All just to get what they want. In this series, I'm enlisting the help of 3 experts.
That man should stay behind bars for the rest of his life.
2 senior officers who've put hundreds of offenders behind bars.
He was in such a lofty position that he thought he was untouchable.
And a psychologist who can analyse the criminal mind.
He's a narcissist. He doesn't feel remorse.
In this series, I'll be investigating why some cops put themselves on the wrong side of the law, abuse their power, and commit horrific crimes. This predator raped, attacked, and tortured many women and told them he was untouchable because he was a cop. Hertfordshire Police attend the house of Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick. Carrick has been accused of rape by an unnamed woman.
These are the necessities that I've just explained to you.
No necessities. Okay.
Well,
And their body-worn cameras capture a defiant Carrick.
well, allow you to get some close
What is it you're searching for?
articles relating to the offences
in St Albans.
in 2020. This is the allegation that's been made to us, okay, sir?
There's no necessity.
Yes, there is.
I've been a police officer for 20 years.
Right, David.
Do you want me to come naked like this?
No, just understand you're under arrest,
I know
okay?
I'm under
Just
arrest.
explain to us, what do you need?
I'll hold it like this. Don't
Right.
worry about
Can one of my colleagues go and get you stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
it.
For Carrick, after 17 years as a serial sex offender hiding in plain sight, the game was finally up.
Where are your keys, then? We'll bring those at least. Okay.
David Carrick was no ordinary cop. He was elite, cleared by the Met to carry a gun and guard members of government, including the Prime Minister. But all the time, Carrick was waging a campaign of terror as a serial sex offender and getting away with it. Until in 2021, an unnamed woman came forward and accused a trusted, vetted police officer of rape. To help me unravel this case and find out how Carrick was able to get away with it for so long, I'm enlisting the expert help of former Detective Chief Superintendent Sue Hill. So, could you tell us who was David Carrick?
Started off his life as a soldier, and then he joined the Metropolitan Police, and he was serving as a response driver in South London.
And what would his day-to-day be as a police officer? What would his duties be?
Basically, a uniform cop, people make a 999 call or a 101 call, and he responds to whatever he's called to. So from theft, shoplifting, right up to rape, murder, could be the first on scene at serious crime. I think a response officer is the most critical role in the Met. You have to think on your feet. You have to assess what's going on. You have to keep your wits about you, and you make quick decisions based on what's in front of you.
How did he come about being arrested?
A lady had come forward who he had raped previously, and she felt she now had the confidence to report him, and that's why he was arrested.
What unfolded was a shocking story of deception and brutal sexual assault. After the woman met Carrick through a dating app in September 2020, they arranged to have a drink in a busy pub in St Albans. It was a warm evening. Carrick had pre-ordered wine for his companion, and it now appears it may have been drugged.
He made her feel very safe because he said, you know, I'm a police officer, showed his warrant card. So immediately she was obviously feeling at ease. I'm going to be safe with him. And how wrong could she be? She was actually meeting a monster. She was really wobbly, unsteady on her feet. And then he took her to another pub, and then she remembers being kind of dragged and semi-unconscious and was absolutely convinced it wasn't through drink. And then when he got her into the hotel, he brutally raped her and threw her in the bath. When he's asleep, she grabs her belongings and leaves. And she'd had 2 fractured ribs. But again, she wouldn't report it because she thought, he's a police officer, no one's going to believe me. I went there to the hotel room. I went there of my own volition. I think it's consensual. And so she never reported it.
Oh, well, I mean, it's just horrible to think that she's had to live with that, knowing what's happened to her and couldn't do anything about it. It would be 13 months before Carrick's traumatised victim went to the police, and the timing of her allegations was no coincidence.
Enough is enough! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
The woman came forward just a day after another Met cop, Wayne Couzens, was sentenced for the murder of Sarah Everard.
One bad apple! Rots the barrel! One bad apple!
I'm on my way to St Albans, where Carrick committed some of his most horrific crimes. I'm meeting Lizzie Dearden, a journalist who covered the case for the Independent newspaper.
I was at that first hearing in October 2021. At that point, what we had was one woman making allegations about a date that they had been on in 2020. She said that he raped her extremely violently in a hotel after deliberately getting her so drunk that she felt completely unable to escape. At that time, David Carrick denied everything. And during a debate with the judge, one of the barristers actually called that case an unexceptional allegation of rape. The argument was essentially he wasn't particularly dangerous, and that in fact he was so little of a threat that he could just be released back into the community. But as we saw, quite quickly, this wasn't unexceptional in any way.
I want to ask you, as a woman, how this felt for you, reporting on this.
As a woman living in London, it really made you question everything you thought you knew about safety and about the police. This man was a Metropolitan Police officer, and an armed one at that. And quickly, journalists found out that he was in the same unit as Wayne Couzens, who had murdered Sarah Everard.
Wow. And over the weeks and months to follow, it would become clear that there were many other victims, and that Carrick's crimes stretched back years.
That night, I felt that I'd encountered evil. For the past 19 years, I've been lost in my own life, mainly due to this one event. Although I am older, I feel I am reliving the trauma that happened such a long time ago. The memories of what he did have always been very painful, but the truth of that night should be told.
It seemed Carrick's reign of terror began not long after he first became a police officer, nearly 20 years earlier. This was just the beginning of the investigation into David Carrick. Things get worse from here. A lot worse.
So I've been a police officer for 20 years.
Right, David.
Do you want me to come naked like this?
No, just understand you're under arrest, okay?
David Carrick, an elite Metropolitan Police officer cleared to carry a gun and protect the highest politicians in the land, had been arrested for the alleged rape of a 50-year-old woman. His secret life as a serial sex offender was about to be exposed.
Today, an officer suspended by the Met emphatically denied raping a woman he met on the dating app Tinder. PC David Carrick, who is 46, was arrested on Saturday and charged last night.
The story was getting media coverage, and as people started speaking about it, others saw Carrick's face and came forward. Howard Groves, a former detective chief inspector with over 30 years' experience, can tell me how police set about investigating one of their own.
Carrick was arrested, and at that time he denied any involvement in any rape incidents. He saw himself as, you know, the Rambo cop. He'd been in the police for 20 years, and here comes officers in the early hours of the morning to arrest him for what, as far as he was concerned, were false allegations.
A team of 40 officers and staff was assigned to the case.
Those officers who were on that inquiry had to sign disclaimers saying that they would not disclose any of the information in relation to that case, because the officers in charge would have realized that the press would want an awful lot of information about it, and they wanted to stop leaks within that inquiry as well. So it was a somewhat sophisticated rape investigation.
The new allegations against Carrick stretched back almost 20 years. One of the earliest was from a woman referred to as Victim T. Carrick attacked her just 2 years into his police career.
In 2003, Carrick was in a pub and he met a young lady. She was only 20 at the time, and he invited her back to his place for a party.
The victim's words are taken from her impact statement and are spoken by an actor.
I distinctly remember his words. "Come on, you can trust me. I'm the safest person you can be around. I'm a police officer."
But at Carrick's flat, there was no party. They were alone.
And then he intimidated her with what she believed to be a firearm, a handgun to her head.
I honestly thought he was going to kill me that night. I thought he was going to rape me and kill me, and that my life would be over.
Carrick's injured and terrified victim escaped the flat and went to A&E.
The nurse and the doctor asked if I knew who had assaulted me. When I replied it was a police officer, the nurse told me that it wasn't the first time she had heard this. She told me it was going to be hard getting it to go to the court, as the law tends to protect their own. After consideration, I didn't feel like I had much choice.
She never reported it.
I felt ashamed, dirty and sick, and was in so much pain. I remember aching all over from the terrible things he did to me that night.
This attack on Victim T had taken place 18 years before the incident that led to Carrick's arrest in 2021. Alarmingly, it suggested that Carrick had been abusing his position as a police officer to rape women throughout his 20-year career. The common theme with both victims is the way they was approached. In open, public spaces, telling him he was a cop. This man was very calculated in what he was doing. Psychologist Serena Simmons is going to help me understand Carrick's mindset. She believes he was an opportunist who knew how to play his victims.
Ultimately, Carrick wanted to get people within his grasp. He wanted to have power over them and he wanted to control them. But he was emotionally intelligent enough to know when to switch on the charm. And you can trust me, I'm a police officer, you're really safe with me. And I think that was part of the arousal as well, is he's luring them in, it's bait, he's getting them to trust him. So he can finally get them in a really vulnerable position and really just do what he wants with them, and that was really the aim.
That's the worst thing for me, is innocence. The more innocent they were, the more they trusted him. He could just do what he wanted, because on the flip side of that is terror, and he thrived on that.
If they didn't fall for his charms and his ways, he would actually be quite aggressive towards them. But if they kind of fell for that, they were a potential victim. So what he did then was groom those people who fell for the charm to then kind of pull them closer to him.
And when it came to selecting his prey, it seems no one, not even the people he worked with, was off limits. In 2021, as public awareness grew, more potential victims came forward. Shockingly, one of them was a police colleague of Carrick, who'd not dared to report him for 17 years. They'd worked together in a traffic patrol section.
When you work very closely with somebody in the police, you know, you spend hours together, they work together in a van, close proximity, getting to know each other. And it was flirty, very casual relationship. She's single, he's single. She was attracted to him. She described him as being dedicated, hard-working, good team player. And then it progressed, and then one night she was going back to his house.
She was expecting consensual sex.
But no, when she went into that bedroom, around his bed were pictures of him in uniform, in the army, with a gun, and it was all very different. He changed, and suddenly he threw her down on the bed and turned her over, flicked her over, and said, "This is how we do it. This is how we have sex."
What I don't get, which is bothering me, is she was willing to come back for consensual sex, but that's not enough for him. He doesn't want that. He wants her to fight. He wants her scared.
Absolutely. He doesn't want consensual sex. He's not getting off on that. He wants to be in charge. He wants to control. He wants his victim to be submissive. And she's somebody who's dealt with sexual offences. So has always thought to herself, if that happened to me, I'm going to put up a fight. I'm not going to submit to this. But when you're totally overwhelmed and controlled by Carrick, she couldn't do anything. And he forced himself on her, and he raped her.
I can't understand why Carrick would attack a police colleague who he worked with so closely and with whom there appeared to be a mutual attraction. Why then rape her?
What we need to understand is that that was his aim all along. He only was nice at the start as a means to an end. He was, I believe, always going to rape her. He was always going to do that. He was grooming her and luring her in. He knew exactly what to do to get her into a really vulnerable position so he could dominate her and do what he wanted to.
You know, she's a police officer. She didn't feel she could report it. That's how much control and power he yielded. And he knew that she was never going to report it because how will it look? And she would know, if I report it, I went back there for consensual sex. Who's going to believe her? His word against hers.
None of these victims had previously felt strong enough to report his crimes. Carrick had repeatedly told them they wouldn't be believed because he was a police officer. By 2021, Carrick had been getting away with these horrific attacks for nearly 2 decades. And former Detective Howard Groves believes he would have felt completely secure in his criminality.
He'd always done that. He's never really had any pushback in the sense of somebody reporting the allegations. If you're committing that type of crime over and over and over, and the victims aren't coming forward, are you going to stop? Well, you're not.
Well, you're going to get caught eventually. Surely somebody's going to say something.
Well, he obviously doesn't think that. And he probably thinks, I'm a police officer. I can deny it.
As more and more cases came trickling through to police investigators, questions started to be asked about how Carrick's 17-year reign of terror went undetected for so long, particularly as Carrick revelled in his forced nickname, Bastard Dave. By the end of 2022, 13 women had managed to find the courage to come forward, many of them years after Carrick had attacked them. But were there warning signs earlier that this man was a violent predator and rapist? In October 2021, after serving Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick was arrested for the rape of one woman, the case snowballed, and 12 others found the courage to report him for violent sexual assaults years earlier. The question is, how was he able to get away with it for almost 2 decades? It could be argued that there was multiple opportunities to stop Carrick. It was first reported back in 2000, even before he became a police officer. 21 years before his arrest for rape, he'd broken into the home of an ex-girlfriend to steal perfume and underwear. When he sent her abusive messages, she reported him.
An allegation of burglary is made, as well as malicious communication. It's reported to the police, it's investigated, but the victim and Carrick came to an agreement that he would pay her money for the damage that was caused. That matter is resolved and no further action taken.
Despite 2 crime reports on the police computer system, incredibly, Carrick was accepted into the Metropolitan Police Force in August 2001. It baffles me how these people are in the police force?
It's difficult. If somebody wants to join the police service, they're not going to exhibit those negative traits that they have. They are going to toe the line, they're going to say the right things, they're going to do the right things. When they're doing training exercises and everything else that you do, or about see how people communicate with others, they're going to do the right things.
So you think there was colleagues that probably knew what he was like and just didn't say anything?
Possibly, because some of his colleagues call him Bastard Dave. So that tells you something. Why would you refer to somebody like that in the first instance? Unless you knew that they were somebody who was unprofessional when he was out dealing with members of the public on the street or in relationships that he had. But that should have been a red flag.
Yeah, 100%. And complaints were made about Carrick's behaviour as a police officer from the start.
Carrick's early career is punctuated with allegations made of him being unprofessional. There was a stop and search incident where the person that was stopped claimed that he was rude and aggressive. There was also an instance where he used his CS spray inappropriately. You know, you'd have thought that should have been a warning sign to the police, but that's not uncommon. There are lots of police officers who have complaints made against them, sometimes malicious or otherwise, but they are resolved. So those instances would not necessarily result in him being disciplined or losing his job.
Journalist Lizzie Dearden was horrified when she learned of Carrick's checkered history during his trial. When you was looking into the past of David Carrick, should he have been stopped before any of this happened? Was there red flags?
It was not until the year that he got arrested that rape was reported, but what had been reported is a pattern of behaviour towards women. And instead of looking at those incidents over the years, even things that looked minor, the Metropolitan Police looked at them individually and shut each one of them down. He was never arrested, he was never prosecuted, he was never disciplined. And if he had been, there's no way he would have been able to abuse women for as long as he did.
Carrick first met the woman police call victim F in 2008. By this time, he had violently assaulted at least 2 other women.
He did have a 2-year relationship with a young woman who he met in a bar. And she was 21 at the time, he was 33, so he was quite a lot older. She ended up living with him for 2 years, but during that 2 years, there was nothing but violence, controlling, coercive behaviour. He was a monster to her. Lots of sexual assaults, rapes, and that went on for 2 years.
But one night, the abuse escalated.
He got a knife and he slashed all her clothes. In fact, she was screaming and the neighbours called the police, and when the police arrived, he hid the knife.
She must have been thinking, please help me, you know, he's going to kill me here. You know what I mean? He's waving a knife around, slashing up her clothes.
She's feeling threatened. She's had 2 years under his control. So, you know what? In front of the police, she probably wouldn't have told them everything, what she'd been through, because she's so intimidated by him. Why wouldn't you be scared to death of him? And there was no further action taken. I'm assuming it put it down to it's a domestic incident and nothing ever happened about that. And he hid the knife.
Carrick continued his attacks on other women, and 7 years later, in 2016, began a new relationship. Carrick ramped up control with his next victim, who he persuaded to live with him. He repeatedly raped her, within earshot of her 10-year-old daughter, and controlled everything she did.
He controlled what they ate, what they wore, where they went. There is a clear pattern with this form of abuse. It's called coercive and controlling behaviour. And one of the key things it does is isolate victims from their support networks, their family, their friends. And David Carrick would get the password to their phone, look through all of their messages. So he made sure that there was no one they felt they could speak to, no one they could confide in, and no one who could give them the strength to face up to what was happening and to help them leave.
It took 6 months before this woman could get away from Carrick with her daughter. I can't understand why anyone could be in a relationship and inflict this level of abuse.
He gets sexual pleasure out of the domination aspect. So To be in a relationship with someone is just to have that at his beck and call. It's to have it on tap. It's to be able to tap into that arousal whenever he wants to, which is why it worked in his favour to enter a relationship with someone so he could do that ongoingly when he felt like it.
I'm looking next at a case where Carrick took his abuse to another level. The police called her Victim J. By the time Carrick met her in 2017, he was a serial rapist and abuser. Just like his previous victims, they met in a pub, but this time he played the long game. In the beginning, she called him her ray of sunshine.
Her first view of him was he was kind, seemed caring. He obviously yet again made sure he told her that he was a police officer, so she felt secure. She'd just come out of a relationship and was looking to move on with her life. And he convinced her at a very early stage that she should come and live with him and he would look after her. And she said she was besotted by him. But as soon as she moved out and came to live with him, the other side of him came out.
When you're looking at someone who commits crimes like Carrick has, what you typically see is escalation over time. So he would have started doing things that in his eyes were minor discretions, maybe touching, groping, saying things that were inappropriate, until it was kind of full submission by the person that he was dominating and degrading.
And if she didn't do what he wanted, there'd be a fit of rage towards her, shout and scream at her, and it'd go as far as getting her to undress, and he'd stick her in a little cupboard underneath the step and leave her overnight, freezing cold. But then, the other side of him, the same way, he would then take her out and they'd go for walks, they'd go climbing. So he was like a Jekyll and Hyde. So she got rewarded when she did what he wanted her to do, and the moment she didn't, he would then mete out degrading acts against her.
So even if he had a relationship with someone he so-called cared about, he completely controlled every single thing they did?
Yeah. He tried to influence what she ate, how much exercise she did. He even went as far as having CCTV in his home, which he would monitor what she was doing around the house.
Throughout his relationship with this woman, he violently raped her and physically tortured her and forced her into degrading acts.
He used to urinate in her mouth and make her drink his urine. I mean, he just inflicted every demeaning behaviour, controlling behaviour that you can think about on this poor woman. The more he did it, the more isolated, the more controlled she became, the more vulnerable. She even left her job as a mental health nurse, and he controlled everything she did. In fact, he sent her a message with a picture of him in uniform saying, "Remember, I am the boss," and that's the photograph he sent. How intimidating is that? He used his chain, he used to whip her, and then he used to take pictures of the injuries on her body that he used when he was whipping her with his chain.
He catalogued those injuries. Psychologist Serena Simmons believes these long-term relationships were the ultimate form of domination for Carrick.
It's why he was so utterly cruel to them. He wanted to see their pain, to see their degradation, and it's that gave him the thrill, which is, again, it's hard for us to understand, but that was the function of his crimes. That's what he did it for.
If you are being treated like that, why would you just not leave?
Someone that gets stuck in a relationship like that, and they are stuck because of utter fear that if I go against what this person is saying, that it will be worse, that they won't be believed, that they may even suffer violence that's even worse than what they've suffered already.
The woman eventually found the courage to leave Carrick, but it took 10 months and a family intervention to help her escape.
Well, fortunately, her sister supported her, and she eventually left and went off with her sister, who lives some distance away. In fact, when she did eventually leave, she took the chain with her, and she took it away because she thought, you know what? No other woman's going to be beaten with this chain. And that was introduced in evidence, and because that's what he used to physically attack her, not only raping her, not only controlling her, but actual physical assaults on her as well.
I want to know if there was anything in Carrick's work as a police officer that could have taught him how to subdue his victims without the risk of getting caught. Lizzie Dearden thinks there was.
He had actually done a course on domestic abuse. What he would have learned in that course is what's needed for a charge, what's needed to take a case across the line. Wow. And that also teaches you what will stop a case, what's not enough, what will stop a case going forward. And it seems likely that he used that knowledge from way back in 2005. And his experience as what's called a response officer going to day-to-day calls, a lot of them would have been domestic abuse, some of them would have been sexual assault. And he took all of that knowledge and put it into how he treated women to make sure that they would be as reluctant as possible to go to the police.
On many occasions between 2000 and 2021, Carrick was reported to different police forces, but it seems nothing was done until one brave woman made a phone call that opened the floodgates. After multiple women stepped up and recounted graphic horror stories of the rape and torture they suffered at his hands, elite Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick is under arrest and in the custody of police colleagues. But even as the investigators sift through the harrowing testimonies, he continues to deny the accusations. All right, so this video is where Carrick is being arrested.
These are the necessities that I've just explained to you. Therefore,
his arrest at his home in the early hours of October 2nd, 2021 took him completely by surprise. I'm watching the moment his evil world came crashing down with psychologist Serena Simmons.
Well, it'll allow you to get some close.
What is it you're searching for?
Articles relating to the offences
in St Albans.
In 2020. This is the allegation that's been made to us, okay, sir?
There's no necessity.
Yes, there is.
I've been a police officer for 20 years.
Right, David.
Did you hear that?
I certainly did.
He's also trying to still play the fact that I'm a police officer. You can't arrest me.
Absolutely, still hiding behind the facade and still trying to dominate the conversation as well. So really trying to be evasive and still control what people are doing. Also, maybe I know more than you. I've been doing this longer than you. So we don't know the age or the profile of the person that's asking the questions. So even in that position that he's in, he's still trying to have some hand in dominating the situation.
Right, yeah.
Do you want me to come naked like this?
No, just understand you're under arrest, okay?
No.
Just explain to us, what do you need?
Hold it like this. Don't
Right.
worry about it.
Can one of my colleagues go and get you stuff?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
We'll just pause it there. Right. Look at him. Hands crossed, folded like this, head down. But what does that body language tell you?
I think this has caught him obviously completely off guard. It's the middle of the night, he's naked, so being in this position would have made him feel incredibly vulnerable. So this is not someone who's used to feeling this way, which is why I think we're seeing something really unusual in how he's presenting here. And yet we see this pathetic character now. He's almost shrunken to this little boy because he's not used to being this vulnerable.
Enough is enough! Enough is enough! Enough is enough! Enough is enough!
Once the investigators had enough evidence to put a case together against Carrick, they submitted the first charge and triggered a secondary wave of victims.
Carrick, once he was charged, he was detained in Belmarsh prison. His name was out there. And then other victims, realising he's now in prison, he can't get them, they came forward, believing then actually the police would be on their side and believe what's happened to them. And then one by one, those charges, indictments were laid against him and he appeared at Crown Court.
He was a serving police officer with a duty to protect others, but instead he's one of the worst sexual offenders in modern history.
13 women between them brought 53 charges against David Carrick, including rape, assault, false imprisonment and coercion. Carrick pleaded not guilty to all of them.
When someone gets arrested and they get charged, and before they go to court, they'll normally plead not guilty for the simple reason they want to make sure that the prosecution have everything possible to convict their client. So the defense will say, no, we don't plead, because if 2 or 3 victims have cold feet at the end of the day and say they don't want to know for whatever reason, if I've pleaded, that's it. I'm going inside. So it's a game that the barristers and the lawyers play during that judicial process. He would have gotten advice to say, you plead not guilty, right up until the last point.
The 48-year-old former constable arrived at Southwark Crown Court after admitting attacks on 12 victims over 17 years.
14 months after his arrest, with a mountain of evidence against him, Carrick finally changes his plea.
Carrick looked down as the counts were read out at Southwark Crown Court, the only words to leave his mouth: guilty.
It takes almost an hour for the court to read through the charges against him. Carrick pleads guilty to all of them, but one.
The only case eventually that he pleaded not guilty to was the lady that came forward and who was the most recent attack. If it hadn't been for her, he would still be a serving police officer and still preying on the vulnerable people out there.
Why would he plead guilty to all the other charges and not that one?
The only thing I can think is that it was revenge. It was that woman coming forward that sparked the first charge. It was that charge that sparked the media coverage. It was that media coverage that caused the other victims to come forward and ultimately his years and years of lies to fall down. I can only think that it was some form of revenge on that woman for being the first and for causing all of this to happen.
So in his eyes, it's a little win for him?
Yeah, it was one last move of control, one last way of damaging a woman, and that's the one case where the prosecution said they weren't going to chase him for it, and essentially he got away with it.
Right to the end, Carrick played the control game, even with the justice system itself. Even after changing his plea, he tried to argue for leniency in the sentencing by claiming a traumatic childhood.
He's alluded to having a very bad upbringing, very negative, his stepfather being very abusive, and we know that they've said that what he has said about his upbringing is false.
I think they were living in what I would describe as a normal, happy family environment. He was a bright youngster, but things changed once his mother divorced and married someone else. He didn't like his stepfather or his step-siblings, and that created a lot of friction within the family.
But the court rejected Carrick's version of events and the suggestion that his upbringing had any bearing on the pain and suffering he inflicted on others.
For me, it was 50-50. Is this person exhibiting signs of psychopathy? He actually did spend some time in Rampton Hospital for assessment. Having worked there myself, ex-colleagues of mine would have assessed him, and he was deemed to be functional, so no other personality disorders or mental health issues. So you're looking at someone really who is just bad.
In February 2023, Carrick is sentenced at Southwark Crown Court.
The details of David Carrick's crimes are truly shocking. I suspect many will be appalled and sickened by his actions. But I hope the victims and the public more widely are reassured that no one is above the law, and the police service will relentlessly pursue those offenders who target women in this way.
He received 36 life sentences with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 30 years imprisonment. Still not long enough.
PC David Carrick was an armed officer in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command. Throughout it all, he bragged that his position as a police officer would protect him. And for 18 years, that seemed to be the case.
Carrick is convicted and off the streets, but it's a dark day for the Metropolitan Police.
Serious questions are being asked today about why the Metropolitan Police failed to spot just how dangerous Carrick was, despite being informed of repeated allegations against him during his 20-year career.
For nearly 2 decades, a serial rapist has worked in their midst. He was one of their most vetted cops, a parliamentary protection officer cleared to carry a gun and guard the highest politicians in the land.
There'll be women across London and more widely. This prompts them to question whether the police can keep them safe. And for that reason, I think it's important that I recognise that we failed, and I'm sorry, and I know we've let women down. One of my top priorities was restoring trust, and to do that, I know I need to be ruthless in rooting out those who corrupt our integrity. On my watch, we'll be ruthless about restoring our integrity and about winning back the trust of Londoners.
Do you think there's anything the police could have done sooner to stop David Carrick?
We know that there were at least 5 different forces that were investigating Carrick, and they all kept that information to themselves. If they had a system, at least if they had a joined-up approach, the Met would have known from the 5 different forces what those allegations were, and they could then decide what they were going to do. But they didn't have that system in place to be able to alert the Met that this was an individual here where allegations of domestic assault and abuse had actually been made. Most of those occasions, no further action was taken.
It's difficult to say we can ever stop a man like David Carrick. When he pleaded guilty, it meant that his victims didn't have to be questioned. It was a huge relief, but it also meant that he didn't have to be questioned. So one of the big questions about David Carrick is why? Why he did it, what made him do it, so many years, so many women. And because we don't have that knowledge, it's hard to know what can be done to stop it happening again. We don't really know what drives men to do this. Really, we should be stopping men raping women, but a lot of the focus has ended up on women stopping themselves being raped by men.
David Carrick, an ex-uniformed police officer, is officially one of the most prolific sex offenders in modern British history. It's only the courage of his victims that finally brought his reign of terror to an end.
I feel that I have missed out on 19 years of my life because this man did this terrible thing to me. He took away who I was and left me lost in my own life. The truth of that night should be told, and he should be held accountable for his actions.
He's not a cop. He's let the reputation of policing down. He's a really, really bad apple. He's not up for parole until about 2052. Let's hope he never gets out. That man should stay behind bars for the rest of his life.
David Carrick loved the power of his position and used it to abuse women and get away with it for nearly 2 decades. This evil, twisted monster of a man was brought down by the very people he thought he had power over. And in the end, these brave women stepped forward to make sure he could never do it again. Catching criminals is no easy job.
Raping is arrest you.
But it's even harder when the criminal is a cop turned bad.
He liked having power and authority and status and a uniform.
When the police officers who were sworn to protect us turned to rape.
She was actually meeting a monster.
Murder.
What happened in those minutes or moments or seconds where he chose to go and get a weapon?
Robbery.
He knows where the money is, he knows where the drugs are.
And even blackmail and poisoning. All just to get what they want. In this series, I'm enlisting the help of 3 experts.
That man should stay behind bars for the rest of his life.
2 senior officers who've put hundreds of offenders behind bars.
He was in such a lofty position that he thought he was untouchable.
And a psychologist who can analyse the criminal mind.
He's a narcissist. He doesn't feel remorse.
In this series, I'll be investigating why some cops put themselves on the wrong side of the law, abuse their power, and commit horrific crimes. This is a story of a police officer who apparently had every reason to be happy. But on the night before he was due to fly out for his fairy tale wedding, his wife-to-be was involved in what looked like a very unfortunate accident. It's 2:15 a.m. Driving on a lonely road near Bolton in Greater Manchester are a young couple, Claire Howarth and her fiancé Martin Alex Forshaw, known as Alex. Alex and Claire are both dedicated serving police officers with impeccable records. In a matter of hours, they are due to fly to the Caribbean to get married. This young cop had everything. A woman who loved him, a nice house, good job. He had a future. But at 2:25 a.m, everything changes. Forshaw makes a 999 call, telling the emergency services they've been involved in a devastating crash. Police officers who arrive at the scene find Claire with catastrophic head injuries, but Alex appears to be barely injured. He tells police Claire veered off the road and crashed into undergrowth at 60 miles an hour. While paramedics treat Claire, police look at the scene. They have one person severely injured and the other with barely a scratch, and no other vehicle involved. So what has happened? I'm just heading towards Harwood in Bolton, Greater Manchester, to where Claire Howarth's BMW was found crashed into a hedge. Beverly Walkden is a journalist who covered this case from the beginning.
So this is the road where the crash happened. As you can see, it's quite a long road. It's quiet.
It would have been at night as well, so it would have been really dark along this road.
Yeah.
So you can see why a crash could have happened here.
Yes. When the police arrived, the car had gone into the hedge. They could see that there was a female driver and that she was injured.
And Forshaw had phoned the police and said she just veered off the road and crashed.
Well, he said that while they were driving, she had knocked into something, hit something while she was trying to reach down for a CD, and at that point, she'd veered off the road.
What happens then is Forshaw goes off to a hospital because obviously they think, well, if he's been involved in the crash, he'll need checks, and Claire's taken as well.
Yes, yeah.
As Claire is rushed to hospital with serious head injuries, paramedics and police survey the scene. To find out more about what they would have been looking for, I'm calling in former Detective Chief Inspector Howard Groves, who has 30 years' experience. When you arrive at the scene of what looks like an accident, what's the first things you're looking for?
The first thing the officers would have been doing would be asking for an explanation. So Forshaw would have been asked exactly what happened, and then the officers would then try and make a quick assessment as to what he said, whether it fits what he's saying.
Well, even I can see there's very little damage to the car.
No, well, there's near enough scratch marks at best, but then there's no damage to the windscreen.
Yeah.
Because bearing in mind she had significant injuries to her head, you'd expect, if this was an accident, you'd expect to see some damage to it. When you're looking at the tyre marks, there's no tyre marks as if the vehicle is going at a significant speed and then ends up in that position.
So would then, if you think, hang on, something's happened here, would you then look at it as a crime scene?
The officers would have treated that as a crime scene straight away. Just looking at the bare facts and information that they were given. Their view would be, let's prove otherwise. So they would call in the collision reconstruction team. They would then treat this as a crime scene because her injuries would suggest that she may not have survived it. It would be cordoned off. They would have taken photographs.
But it's safe to say, as soon as they've seen this, they've gone, something else has happened.
Yeah. His explanation just did not marry up. And I would be very surprised if a police officer finds himself in that similar scenario and just say, yeah, okay, it's an accident and that's it. Forshaw would have to explain the injuries and that the position that the vehicle is in, there is something wrong here.
Something about this scene just doesn't ring true. But Alex Forshaw and his fiancée seem, on the surface, to be a happy young couple. He's due to make Claire his wife in 5 days' time. And it seems they're looking forward to a golden future. I'm calling in former Detective Chief Superintendent Sue Hill. In a 30-year policing career, she has investigated countless serious crimes. So we've got Martin Alexander Forshaw. What do we know about him?
Martin was also known by his friends as Alex. He was a young police officer in Cheshire. He joined in 2003 and he was on a response team, a uniformed cop that would respond to, everyday calls in Macclesfield in Cheshire, and he was an expert in self-defence. It will teach you how to disarm someone, how to protect yourself, how to make sure that if someone's going to attack you, that it's going to have the least impact on your body.
And he had a partner?
So when he joined the police service, he had a partner and he also had a child. And what happened, that relationship broke up. And then he met Claire Howarth. Claire was 31 years old. She was also a police officer. Claire was a really vivacious young woman who'd worked out in Ibiza, liked travelling, and she liked the high life. She was very different to Forshaw.
After just 6 months, the couple moved in together and got engaged on holiday in Mexico. They planned a dream wedding on the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. Their flight was booked for the 7th of May.
Claire was full of excitement, posting on social media, getting excited about the wedding, going to be going off, drinking wine and dancing, having a great time, and so excited to be marrying the love of her life.
May the 6th, 2009, the day before they were due to fly off, seemed to start out as a happy day for the couple. Claire had been to a Manchester shopping mall to buy last-minute things for their holiday.
They were getting ready to go away the next day. She was really excited about getting married. So everything was fine. It appeared, both hard-working cops, and they're going to get married.
But less than 2 hours after posting her happiness on social media, Claire is being rushed to hospital.
They're trying to save her life. Sadly, she died later of those injuries.
A young woman, so full of life with a great future ahead of her, has now lost her life. Police are busy checking out the scene, trying to piece together what exactly has happened here.
His view was she was driving the car, traveling about 60 miles per hour, and she then somehow veered off the road and hit the hedge. And that's why she ended up with the injuries that she had.
Experts arrive at fatal accidents and they measure everything. They measure the distance of braking, they check the car, they check the impact, and they would know immediately that she did not die from a fatal road accident.
His story doesn't tally with what they can see, which is the car in the hedge. There's no damage to the bumper at all. The airbags haven't been deployed.
Forshaw's at the hospital. The police are starting to say, well, this doesn't look right. So what do they do then?
So the police are presented with what Forshaw says is a car crash, basically. The car's veered off the road, but they're clearly not buying that. There's a female driver. She doesn't have injuries that tally with a car crash. Yeah. So, of course, they start to widen out their investigation.
So then straight away, surely, the suspect is Forshaw.
Oh, Forshaw's there. He's got taken to the hospital because he's got injuries and shock. However, you are now looking at suspicious death, and this is when the murder alarm bells are ringing and you start calling everybody out because this isn't right. And the fact he's a police officer it really is irrelevant. He is now a suspect in the case of a murder.
"7th of May 2009. And the morning PC Alex Forshaw was due to fly out to his fairy tale wedding in the Caribbean. Instead, his fiancée and fellow police officer Claire Howarth is dead. Killed, he says, after the car she was driving crashed on a country road at 60 miles an hour. Now, I don't quite buy that story, and neither did the police. I want to piece together what's really happened. With 30 years' experience leading major criminal investigations, Sue Hill can take me through the evidence. They're suspicious that this is something else going on here, isn't there?
Well, she's got, huge injuries to her head. She's bleeding profusely, blood in the passenger seat. blood in the driver's seat, no seat belt. You'd expect the bags, the airbags to have exploded. They haven't. There's hardly any impact to the front of the vehicle. So suddenly you're thinking, how could she have those head injuries? She hasn't gone through the windscreen. You know, how has this been caused?
For the police teams at the scene, their activity is hotting up.
At that point, they would have treated the scene as a crime scene, not a road traffic accident.
Right.
And then the collision reconstruction team would have attended later on that day, and then they would make an assessment.
Meanwhile, the focus of the investigation began to shift. Police at the scene were immediately suspicious, so they went to the couple's house. To find out what they discovered, I've come to Bury in Greater Manchester with journalist Beverly Walkden.
This is the road where the couple lived. Looks pretty ordinary, doesn't it?
So you actually reported from here when this happened?
Yes. By 9 o'clock-ish, we would have been deployed here as reporters to basically feed a live report about what was happening here. We were here when the cordon was around the property and around the whole road, actually. It was really important that we had as much information as possible.
And it turned out that the police had startling new information, which would put a whole new spin on this case. What information did the police tell you what happened in the house?
So what we knew at the time was that officers had arrived here. They had obviously entered the property. In the front lounge, they'd seen quite clearly that there was blood. They'd gone upstairs. In the spare bedroom, there was blood again, and it was obvious to them at that time that there'd been a terrible attack.
So obviously that's where they start piecing together that the accident was just something that he'd put together.
That's right, it didn't make sense.
So now investigators had discovered some kind of incident in the house, followed by a suspicious car accident a few miles away. There's no way. I mean, how can she be in the car and having an accident if there's blood in the house? It's obviously something that's happened in the house.
Something has happened at home, and whatever happened at home escalated.
Police even found blood next to the wedding dress Claire had ready for their ceremony in St. Lucia.
So there you've now got a crime scene, and that is now escalated. It's not a fatal road accident. This is a murder.
In this quiet area of Bury, a stone's throw from Manchester, they are waking up to a murder in their midst.
I think the whole of Greater Manchester was absolutely rocked to the core with what happened here on this road. The thought that a police officer could commit a crime like this sent shockwaves.
It must have been unbelievably shocking for the neighbours, because for all intents and purposes, this came out of the blue.
Yeah, absolutely. The neighbours here were shocked at that time. I remember speaking to some of them, and they said that they'd been a lovely couple, young, nothing untoward about them at all.
Yeah, I think that's what brings it home for me, is it's just any other estate that you've been on.
You know, it's a normal area, it's a family-orientated area. So the facade of this, you know, looks very quiet and peaceful, normal. At that time, it wasn't.
Yeah.
There was something very, very strange going on.
With the discovery of blood at the home of Alex Forshaw and Claire Howarth, the officers at the scene of the crash begin to widen their search.
The search would have been taken place initially by those officers who had contained it to look to see if they could find a weapon.
Right.
She had an injury to her head, significant. They have to look for the weapon, because a lot of times a weapon is concealed or thrown nearby.
Howard's showing me the scene that officers were dealing with.
Normally, from my perspective, you'd look in within 50 yards of where that vehicle is. Can you find anything? If you think that there's likely to be, you can extend that cordon that you're doing. So the officers would have had a search parameter and they'd work to that. So the field would be the next place they would look, because it's obvious she had been hit with something, an object, a heavy object. So the chances are it could still be there. And they were right, because they then found it in the field nearby.
And what was it?
A lump hammer.
I just don't understand. Why, if you've committed
what ended up being murder with a lump hammer. You take it to the scene where you staged an accident and then you just throw it in a field. And he's a police officer. Surely he's going to know they're going to look.
But at the time, he's probably not thinking straight, is he? When you think about it. There's a lot going on in his head. There's nothing to suggest it was premeditated. Yeah? It could have just been a fit of pique. And then his next thought is, I can't leave it in the vehicle, can he? Because the police officers would search that vehicle at some point and come across it. So maybe I'll just chuck it into the field. They may not be thinking about looking for it in there.
He obviously
But he, more than anyone else, should know that if they're going to treat this as a crime scene, then they're going to be looking close by. They don't just look at the vehicle and think that's it. They're going to extend that parameter depending on what they find or don't find, and that lump hammer would be found.
So he's obviously not thinking.
No, he's not. He's not thinking straight.
At this point, Forshaw seems to have forgotten his training as a police officer.
It just stinks of massive panic. So now he's crashed the car, made it look like an accident.
Yeah. We didn't leave the scene. He'd obviously left her in the position in the driver's seat, slumped in the vehicle, then decided he would call the ambulance and the police.
Forshaw is arrested by his fellow police officers. He's now under investigation for the murder of the woman he was about to marry. Under questioning, Forshaw stuck to his story about the car crash until they find the hammer. Then he changes his story and claims he and Claire argued in the house and he is the victim.
He used the defense that Claire was attacking him. But when you look at her stature compared to his, and you look at the blows that he's rained down on her, and he had hardly any injuries, it really doesn't equate. There's no way that that was appropriate self-defense.
I can't get it into my head how you can hit somebody over the head with a hammer. I can't see how it's a reaction.
Well, it isn't a reaction. He didn't do it once. He did it 5 times. He hit her over the head 5 times. That's just not the red mist coming down. He knew when he hit her, struck her, the first blow, and then carried on. There was only one outcome, and that was going to be death or serious injury.
The post-mortem revealed Claire had suffered repeated blows to her head and neck. Forshaw's story was crumbling.
Forshaw was using his police knowledge to make himself out to be a victim, but the evidence against him was starting to stack up.
Bury in Greater Manchester is in shock after a young police constable is arrested for the murder of his fiancée the night before they were due to fly out to the Caribbean to be married.
Martin Alex Forshaw was supposed to be an upstanding, honest police officer. But the story about how his fiancée had died was already falling apart. First, he said Claire Howarth had died in a car accident.
But when the investigators proved that couldn't be true, he changed his story and told police he hit her with a lump hammer, but that he did it in self-defense. Police investigators and forensics teams have worked around the clock, and a clear picture is emerging of what really happened in the early hours of May the 7th, 2009. Former Chief Superintendent Sue Hill is going to take me through it.
But when it comes to the night before they're going to fly over to St. Lucia to get married, what happened then?
Well, they appeared to be having a great time because Claire was posting on Facebook.
At 14 minutes past midnight, her first post is shared.
It looked as if the two of them were having a good time and celebrating before they leave the next day to fly out.
35 minutes later, at 11 minutes to 1, another Facebook post. Followed 1 minute later by an excited text message to a friend. It is the last time anyone hears from Claire. One hour and 35 minutes later, at 2:25 a.m., Alex Forshaw is ringing 999 from the scene of the car crash he has faked. So 1 minute Claire is posting on social media about how happy she is, and the next thing we know, she's lying in her car with catastrophic head injuries. Something happens, but what actually does the evidence tell us?
We know things went wrong, and it looks as if he wanted to end the relationship with Claire. And apparently he says that, you know, he tried to tell her he wanted to break off with her, and she attacked him. And rather than just ending it, the red mist has come down from him, and then he's ended up killing her. He got hold of a hammer, which I've got a copy of the hammer here, a photograph of a similar hammer. That's it there. And he hit Claire over the head with that hammer in their spare bedroom of their semi-detached home.
I don't even think I could hit my worst enemy over the head with a hammer. You've got to know that's going to do some serious, serious damage.
The only thing I would say from my experience, because nothing surprises me about human beings these days, but over many, many years of investigating murders, sometimes drink, drugs, crime of passion, the red mist comes down and people do things that you never expect them to do. So, but on this occasion you think, why didn't you just push her away? How disproportionate, you get a hammer and you smash someone around the head. That's more the red mist coming down. But to do that, he meant business. He was going to kill her.
I can't help but think there's more to the attack than meets the eye. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a motive. But what? I'm going to look at Forshaw's background more closely with former Detective Chief Inspector Howard Groves. He tells me the detectives uncovered key information about Forshaw's private life and his relationship with his ex-partner, Lisa Charles.
He was obviously still in a relationship with the mother of his son at the same time that he's seen Claire. Whether Claire knew that is debatable, but it is certainly anecdotal information to suggest that he was still in a relationship. And he was torn between the two, between wanting to get married, but wanting to have a relationship with the mother of his child. And there is where the problem arose.
So he's still got problems at home and trying to live a lie,
yes, yeah.
Two lives going on,
Yeah.
trying to please two people.
Yeah, and that's difficult to do because some of his colleagues were aware of what was happening. So they knew. So I'd be very surprised if Claire didn't have some inkling about it. So we get to the day before they're supposed to go away to St. Lucia to get married, and she's buzzing, she's happy because she's going away to get married. She does a couple of Facebook messages, and she's basically saying, oh, I'm so happy, you know, we can't wait, we can't sleep, we're waiting to go. So up until that point, if you were just casually looking at her Facebook entry, you'd think everything's fine.
At this point, she's obviously not aware
of what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, because this is what I always find shocking. 1 minute is all fine, and the next minute something horrendous happens, and that's in this case exactly that we know she's happy at 10 to 1, looking forward to going to St. Lucia to go and get married.
And then the bombshell happened. I don't want to go to St. Lucia. I don't want to get married anymore. He was obviously still in a relationship with the mother of his child.
For me, even if he was involved with someone else, the violence of the attack on poor Claire is still impossible to understand. Psychologist Serena Simmons explains the complex web of lies he was weaving to try and maintain relationships with two women.
He was leading a dual life, essentially. He was still seeing his ex-partner, who he had a child with. He'd also set up to have a holiday with her a month or two later. So he was still kind of lying to his ex-partner and kind of giving her false hope about what their future relationship might look like and feel like, while still also lying to the person that he was living with.
Rather than having a conversation and saying he wasn't feeling it and he didn't want to get married, it goes right to the point of the night before they're going to fly out to go and get married.
Yeah, you're right. He left it right up until the day before he essentially snapped.
Is that what you think happened? Do you think he just snapped?
Looking through all the evidence that we have, there's no evidence that this was overly planned in any way. So it seems to be that there's this built-up frustration with the lifestyle he's living.
You snap, you do something. He hit her over the head 5 times with his hammer. that's more than snapped. That's making sure the job's done.
So something clearly triggered him. He didn't know how to tell her he wasn't going to go through with the wedding. But in that moment between whatever triggered him and hitting her over the head with the hammer was a gap in his thinking. So he had time to go away, think about actually going and finding a weapon to use on his partner. And it's in that gap, that's the interesting thing. Why did he choose in that gap to not think about not doing this? He didn't, and that's the snapping part. That's that I'm going to go through with this, I'm going to do it anyway.
After the car crash, forensics teams scoured the house Forshaw shared with Claire Howarth and mapped all the signs of the struggle. Former Detective Chief Inspector Howard Groves has studied the evidence and Forshaw's claims that he acted in self-defence. He's going to take me through Claire's final gut-wrenching moments.
Well, we know he hit her at least 3 times whilst they were in the house together. They were in the spare with a hammer. They were in the spare bedroom, and there are splatterings of blood that later on the police find. And he drags her downstairs when she's probably semi-conscious, puts her into the vehicle, the front passenger seat, and then drives away from the venue. His account was he was going to seek help.
But she's alive at this point.
She's alive, she's semi-conscious.
It's now around 2:15 a.m. on May 7th, 2009, and Forshaw is driving along the dark country road with his bleeding and injured wife-to-be slumped in the passenger seat beside him. He stops at the driveway of an isolated house.
He then decides he's going to take her out of the vehicle, still semi-conscious. He's trying to drag her towards the door. Can't do that because she's obviously fairly heavy, near enough lifeless. So he then just puts her down on the driveway. And then neighbors happen to hear some screaming, and somebody thought they heard somebody say, "I've always loved you." And I've told you I've always loved you.
But she's still alive?
But she's still alive at that point.
On a lonely road, with devastating head injuries sustained when her fiancé hit her with a hammer, Claire Howarth is bleeding and begging Alex Forshaw for her life. But what happens next is truly horrifying. Martin Alex Forshaw, a serving police officer with Cheshire Police, has brutally attacked his fiancée Claire Howarth with a hammer at their home in Bury. In a panic, Forshaw has tried to use his police knowledge to cover up his crime. He has put Claire, who is bleeding and semi-conscious, into her car and driven along a lonely country lane. This is the actual route he would have took on the night that he's attacked her. He would have put her in the car and then he would have drove this route.
Yeah, he didn't get far. He didn't get far in his state of panic.
I'm retracing Claire's final journey with local journalist Beverly Walkden.
It feels rather strange, actually. Obviously sat in the passenger seat now, which is where she would have been in the car on this route. And to try and think about, was she conscious? Was she completely unconscious? Was she able to talk at that point? Was she in a huge amount of pain? It's just horrifying, really.
One thing is clear to me. Forshaw wasn't heading to a hospital or to get help as he later claimed. He was heading out of town. Do you think he knew where he was going? Or do you think he just got in the car and drove? Because it's quite a lot of countryside around here. Look, you can see there's a lot of fields. What do you think?
Really, for somebody who's been trained in the police to look for people who cover their tracks, he didn't cover his tracks very well.
No.
Here we are, somewhere here, where he'd staged the crash. Wow, that journey didn't take long.
No.
5 minutes.
It's a lonely spot. On that night, it would have been very dark and very quiet. Beverly is going to fill in the missing piece of the jigsaw for me. What happened between the fake car crash here and the driveway where he stopped just minutes before with his battered and bleeding fiancée, helpless and semi-conscious in the passenger seat?
Forshaw pulled over into a house not far from where we are now. He said he was trying to seek assistance, but what we know now is that he stopped there. Apparently she wasn't at that point dead. He'd got out of the car, gone into his boot to get a hammer, and in his own words to the lawyer said that he'd hit her with the hammer to put her out of her pain.
Unbelievable. He had a choice there. He could have then phoned for help. He's outside the house. He could have gone and said, I need your phone, or...
Yeah. But even at that point, this, you know, Claire is, you know, she's probably not, you know, completely understanding what's going on, but what's coming to her mind straight away? I love you. I've always loved you. You know, and yet he's got that hammer, and he has just essentially bludgeoned her to death.
You're supposed to love this woman. They were flying out to get married.
10 minutes later, Forshaw is calling 999 after putting Claire in the driver's seat and staging a car crash.
I just keep thinking about Claire still being alive on that driveway and begging for her life. And he could have saved her. But instead, he hits her again. Who does that? I'm asking psychologist Serena Simmons how someone could be capable of such brutality. He decides what he says is put her out of her pain. Basically like putting an animal down. That mindset, what's that about?
So, again, you're speaking like someone who is caring, who thinks about the repercussions of their actions, who doesn't want to see someone in pain or see someone suffering. But at that point, he was only thinking about self-preservation. And again, remembering that he's someone who can't deal with real emotion. So if she's being really emotional, he might be thinking quite quickly what the repercussions of that might be if she survives. And it's just too much to deal with. So my feeling is that he felt at that point that he had to essentially finish the job, which is a horrible way of putting that. But I think he rephrased it. He tried to soften how he worded that. He said, I wanted to put her out of her pain. But actually, I think he was trying to put himself out of pain because he couldn't deal with what she was saying.
The investigators and forensics teams have done their job, and the police have set out their case. Claire Howarth died the night before she was due to fly off for her wedding, at the hands of the man she thought loved her the most, her fiancé and fellow police officer, Alex Forshaw. On the 9th of May 2009, just 2 days after his arrest, Forshaw was charged with Claire's murder. Despite the evidence, Forshaw continues to insist that he killed his fiancée in self-defense after she attacked him when he told her the wedding was off. But former Detective Chief Superintendent Sue Hill doesn't buy this line.
They went to 5 times.
Yeah, 5 times.
That's somebody who has completely gone the other way and is definitely going to kill them.
He was out of control, totally out of control. What was that switch that triggered him to hit her 5 times? He says self-defense. Oh, come on, self-defense?
No.
Yeah, you might have hit her once, but
That's
5
enough.
times. With a hammer. 5 times with a hammer, no. No, he wanted to do her a serious injury.
But what I still don't understand is how someone who seems like a decent person could commit such a brutal killing.
I'm asking psychologist Serena Simmons about how things could go so terribly wrong in such a short space of time.
There's nothing overtly criminal that he was involved in before he did this particular event. I think what we do see, though, when we look at him, is someone who's really immature, who doesn't really know how to express his feelings or communicate fully in his personal relationships. I think it's that frustration around not being able to say what he really wants. It's those qualities that have led to him doing this.
There is an element
suggested by them, the messages she was putting on Facebook, excited, having another drink, and it was early hours of the morning, so it sounds like there's alcohol involved.
Yeah, sadly, yes, that can be a really significant contributing factor. We know that it reduces people's ability to think clearly, it reduces their ability to properly plan and foresee what's going to happen. It also kind of numbs our emotions a great deal as well.
We've all had arguments with our partners, we've all fell out and alcohol-fueled rows, whatever you want to call it. How can it go from one thing to that?
You're right, that escalation is very, very extreme. So he had a previous partner, which was a very serious relationship because they shared a child. They were still actually seeing each other behind Claire's back.
Right, so he had two women he was with at the same time.
Yeah, I think he was essentially having an affair. And for someone of his nature who doesn't like confrontation, I think that would have been quite anxiety-inducing for him to try and keep both of those things going. He didn't want to be with her, but he couldn't communicate. Again, it's not an excuse that he couldn't communicate. It's incredibly sad that he didn't feel he could put the words together to have a conversation with her and just say, look, this isn't working. We can't stay together.
Throughout the police interviews, Forshaw remained adamant that he killed Claire in self-defence. It was now up to the courts to decide.
On the 11th of May, the day they were due to be married in St. Lucia, Forshaw appears in court charged with Claire's murder. He was still claiming he was innocent. Do you think he really thought he was going to get away with it?
I think he hoped to get away with it. I don't necessarily think he knew for sure if he would, but I think he hoped that if he was upset enough, tried to hide the evidence enough, used his knowledge that he had as a police officer to try and construct a crime scene that just maybe he might be believed. But remember again, with all respect, this is someone who's very immature in his thinking. He may have been a police officer, but for me, he did lack a certain intelligence around how to go about doing what he did.
While Forshaw waits for his trial, Claire's funeral takes place a few miles from the home they shared.
There's still many questions to be asked about exactly how and why Claire Howarth died. Questions that add to the sadness of those who today came to say goodbye for the last time.
Claire was 31 years old. She was in the middle of her policing degree. You know, everything in front of her. And I always think, you know what, all the things that her family are going to miss out on, not seeing her get married, not seeing her have children, never see what her potential could have been. And at her funeral, there were over 150 officers that turned up. Each and every one of those cops who know her would be just devastating knowing one of their officers had fallen, and by her fiancé, who was also a cop. It just makes it doubly worse.
On the 23rd of November 2009 at Manchester Crown Court, the trial of Martin Alex Forshaw for the murder of Claire Howarth began.
Howard Groves tells me that on day one, Forshaw has a change of heart.
He changes his plea to guilty at that point, because he also has to think if he contested, there was always a chance that he would get an even greater sentence.
Right, so he's thinking there's far too much evidence here against me.
So the view is you then plead at that point, and the judge will take that into consideration that you've pleaded guilty.
So if I plead guilty to murder and it's obvious that I've done it, all the evidence is against me, I will get a shorter sentence?
Yeah, that's taken into account.
Right, and you think that's obviously why he did it?
Yeah. Because once the weight of evidence is put before him, there can be no other view taken than he committed this murder.
In court, Forshaw's lawyers said he was torn between two women, his fiancée Claire and his ex-partner Lisa Charles, and he lost control. But psychologist Serena Simmons is sceptical.
That's what he's saying now. And maybe in some ways that makes him look like the good guy. Like he told her and she just wouldn't take no for an answer. So he's trying to find excuses for his behaviour. I have no reason to believe what he tells us, given how he's behaved. I do believe, though, maybe that he was torn. We can see that he was torn because he was maintaining the life that he had with Claire while still lying to his ex-partner.
So eventually, having said, oh, it was self-defence, he then pleaded guilty to murder.
Yeah, he maintained his innocence for as long as he possibly could in light of the evidence that was shown, but eventually he did actually confess to what he'd done. And there's also some suggestion that maybe he was just trying to avoid his ex-partner from having to go and testify, and so he was trying to spare her the upset of having to do that.
So maybe in his mind all along, he cared a lot more for his ex-partner and her feelings than the person he's just murdered.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad for Claire, because she's the one that paid the price for this in the end.
Martin Forshaw seems someone any mother would want for their daughter. He too was a police officer. Yet today, Claire's mother saw him jailed for a minimum of 18 years. Claire was her only child.
Claire has left a great void in all of our lives. Our family and her friends were so proud of all she achieved. We will never forget her.
18 years. It just doesn't seem long enough to me.
On the facts presented, life with a minimum of 18 years is, in the views of the courts, a correct decision to make.
Yeah, it's just sad because I think if that was my daughter or my mum or my sister, she doesn't get a chance to live.
I think 99.9% of us would agree with that. But it's part of the judicial system, and we have to work within the confines of that.
He just took it upon himself to take her life. They worked together. They've known each other. They loved each other. They were going to go and get married. And yet in that moment, he hit her and hit her and hit her and then hit her again and one more. And you kind of think, you could have walked away. You still had a chance. You could have called an ambulance. But even when she was dying, he still didn't pick up the phone. He was still trying to save himself. I'm going to get out of this. And then stage the accident. It just shows how very evil he really is.
Sometimes these cases just get under your skin, and this one has with me. Claire lost her life because her fiancé couldn't find the courage to tell her the truth. I still can't get my head around Claire Howard's brutal murder and Forshaw's pathetic attempt to cover it up. You know, the judge was right. He was a coward. And Claire, well, she paid the ultimate price. Catching criminals is no easy job.
Making it so arrest you.
But it's even harder when the criminal is a cop turned bad.
He liked having power and authority and status and a uniform.
When the police officers who were sworn to protect us turned to rape.
She was actually meeting a monster.
Murder.
What happened in those minutes or moments or seconds where he chose to go and get a weapon?
Robbery.
He knows where the money is. He knows where the drugs are.
And even blackmail and poisoning. All just to get what they want. In this series, I'm enlisting the help of 3 experts.
That man should stay behind bars for the rest of his life.
2 senior officers who've put hundreds of offenders behind bars.
He was in such a lofty position that he thought he was untouchable.
And a psychologist who can analyse the criminal mind.
He's a narcissist. He doesn't feel remorse.
In this series, I'll be investigating why some cops put themselves on the wrong side of the law, abuse their power, and commit horrific crimes. This is a story of a police officer who received an award for bravery, but lured into the prospect of easy money, he abused his position as a cop to rob and steal. And for a while, he got away with it. In March 2020, Metropolitan Police Officer Kashif Mahmood signed out a marked patrol car from his station in Stoke Newington. He took the car and picked up what appeared to be another uniformed officer. The pair travelled here to Chingford in Essex, and with their police car, pulled over a black Range Rover on this road. Mahmood then used his police powers to search the vehicle. In the black Range Rover, they discovered a bag filled with thousands of pounds in cash.
But this is where the story gets odd. So instead of arresting the driver, PC Kashif Mahmood just let him go. But he took all the money.
To everyone who knew him, Kashif Mahmood was an upstanding police officer, commended for his bravery. It was Kashif Mahmood's boyhood dream to join the police. As it turned out, his criminal connections ran deep. So did his temptation for easy money and a luxury lifestyle. To help me unravel this case, I'm on my way to meet up with Sue Hill, who has 30 years' experience with the Metropolitan Police, investigating some of the most serious crimes committed in the capital.
So, Kashif Mahmood, what do we know about him?
Kashif Mahmood was from a pretty poor, underprivileged background, surrounded by young people in the same kind of situation. But it's very easy to target kids, you know, the have-nots who haven't got the training shoes, the latest phone, and mum and dad aren't going to buy it for you, and the only way you're going to get that is by joining that gang and being involved in criminality. Kashif grew up surrounded by criminality, a lot of gangs, and he wanted to break out of that. He wanted to go a different way.
So hearing that, he sounds like a person who's got his morals right. He doesn't want to get involved in gangs.
There was peer pressure trying to engage with him, and he didn't want to do that. And in doing so, because he didn't want to join, he ends up getting stabbed. I mean, strength of character to say no, but he ends up as a victim at their hands, seriously injured. I imagine that fueled his kind of ambition to do the right thing, to get away from criminality and protect other young people. And he joined the Metropolitan Police.
Aged 21, Mahmood realised his boyhood dream of becoming a police officer. It wasn't until 10 years later that things started to unravel for him. I've come to the North London police station where Mahmood was based, to meet BBC crime correspondent Tom Simons, who covered this case.
So we're here outside Stoke Newington police station where Mahmood actually worked.
This is a very busy police station. It's a busy part of London. There's a lot of policing to do in this area. And he was what they call team in the police. It's response. He answers 999 calls. He goes when something's happening. It's an exciting job, a stressful job. He works shifts day and night. He's got a lot of freedom to go wherever he wants within this part of London. He's not being watched by a more senior police officer all the time. He's not in a team of detectives where he's been tasked to go and do something.
And for the early part of Mahmood's career, he excelled in his dream job.
We know that he was a good police officer, an active police officer, because he had a commissioner's commendation from Sir John Stevens, the commissioner at the time, in 2014. So that demonstrates he was a committed cop.
But in May 2017, another side of PC Mahmood began to show, when he was guarding a cordon at the site of an incident and was being pestered by a member of the public.
What happened when the protesters kept coming at him and kept coming back at him, making rude remarks and having a go at him, Mahmood basically blew his top and grabbed hold of this bloke, and he was overzealous and pushed him, forced him against the wall, and in doing so hurt his head, caused injuries. The individual was arrested but then made a complaint to the IOPC, and what they do, they investigate the complaint, and they looked at Mahmood's body camera that had video recorded what had happened and said, well, it's overzealous. He overstepped the mark, and he ended up going to magistrates' court.
So he was convicted of an assault?
He was convicted at magistrates' court and then went through a misconduct hearing, and he had his job back.
Hang on. So a police officer can get charged with assault, but then can also get their job back as a police officer?
I've never known it. It didn't happen when I was there, but he absolutely was convicted and then came back into the police service.
Do you think that's right?
No, I don't think it's right. I fully understand when someone's younger, before they join, they might make mistakes. It might be a minor theft or a schoolboy scrimmage or something's happened on a football pitch, something minor. But when you're a police officer, you know, to act disproportionately and overzealous and attack this individual, then I'm surprised that he came back into the police. Very surprised.
Kashif Mahmood was found guilty of assault by beating and was sentenced to 200 hours community service.
He was allowed to keep his job on the force, but after gaining a criminal conviction, his shining record as a decorated officer was shattered.
The Independent Office for Police Conduct said that he had overstepped the mark, and this was criminal activity. So here's a guy who effectively breaks the law in uniform, manages to stay in the police. Maybe that had some impression on him psychologically. It made him think, well, if I can get away with that, maybe there's something else I can get away with.
And something else seems to have been ignited by the incident. Having been convicted of an offence, Mahmood seems to have made contact with old friends from his school days.
Now, I wonder whether or not he was feeling a bit kind of let down by the fact he's been charged with the assault, and now he's really unhappy about what's happened. No one stood by him, and he's been convicted. And was that the thing that triggered him to reconnect with Mohsin Khan and Shabazz and Shahzad? And they were old school friends, old associates from way back.
But these were not any old friends.
These individuals who he'd reconnected with ran a big organised crime group coming out of Ilford in Essex.
Reconnecting with his past was the beginning of the end for Kashif Mahmood. His honourable career as a cop would soon be a distant memory.
On the surface, PC Kashif Mahmood was seen as a model cop, having joined the Metropolitan Police in 2010.
After a challenging upbringing, Mahmood had finally realised his boyhood dream of becoming a police officer. But in 2018, he was convicted of assault whilst on duty for using excessive force.
But despite this criminal conviction, Mahmood was allowed to continue his job as a police officer. But his experience had changed him, as BBC correspondent Tom Simons explains to me.
He avoids going down the wrong path and getting stabbed for that, but then he ends up going onto the wrong side of the law. What do you think happened there?
I think it's his friends. So Mohsin Khan, who is one of his friends, and his two brothers were heavily involved in this gang being run from Dubai. And somehow he ends up having a chat about possibilities. And obviously those possibilities are entirely criminal. And I think that gang's been keeping an eye out for him. They've worked out that the only thing that he could do for them is be a corrupt police officer and use his uniform to try and get something for them.
Was he thinking, who's going to speak out about what I'm doing here?
I think they make him an offer, and who knows? Is it his bad side? Is it boredom? Is it greed? Most crime is really just about greed. But something makes him decide to do what they asked him to do, which was to go out there and to steal money from criminals, which is a pretty dangerous thing to try and do.
Mahmood was ordered by the Khans to target rival criminals using his police powers and relieve them of huge amounts of cash.
So what was the plan Mahmood and his associates came up with?
Basically, they got involved in taking money from drug dealers. They knew when the drug dealers had purchased the drugs, and they also knew when money was exchanged.
The one thing I want to understand is how Mahmood and the other gang members knew where the cash was going to be at any given time.
To help me understand this complex case of criminals stealing from criminals, I've asked for the help of ex-senior detective Howard Groves.
He was stealing, and his gang was stealing from other drug dealers and other criminals. Is that a difficult area for the police?
Of course it is, because 9 times out of 10 the police won't know what's happening. Because if we start right at the beginning, we know it's July of 2019. Mahmood meets somebody called Mushtabi Niazman. Now, that individual was identified as a businessman, but he had actually been arrested and charged with a blackmail offense where he had threatened someone. But for whatever reason, he then fled to Dubai, and the case was discontinued. So you're asking yourself the question of what is his connection with this individual? The connection between them was the Khan brothers. Because the Khan brothers were obviously drug suppliers. Niesman was involved in drugs as well.
In 2019, Kashif Mahmood and two of the Khan brothers flew to Dubai to meet Niesman and discussed a plan to use Mahmood's police status and resources to steal cash from rival gangs.
Niesman in Dubai was controlling the gang, and he was trying to avoid anybody reading the messages that he used to control what was going on in the UK. And so he used EncroChat, this system of encrypted phones that nobody can break into.
Niesman was sending messages over an encrypted communications network known as EncroChat to let Mahmood know the times and places he bought drugs from other gangs. With intelligence sent from the gang's network in Dubai, Mahmood is using his powers as a police officer to steal hundreds of thousands in drug money from rival gangs.
I think what comes across from Niesman is the way he's controlling this operation with Mahmood, who's going out, who's stopping cars and robbing drug couriers. He's saying, let's try this one, let's try that one. He's passing on information. He knows where the money is, he knows where the drugs are, and so he can put his guy in exactly the right place, and of course Mahmood does the rest.
Mahmood was essentially hiding in plain sight, operating under the gang's instructions, intercepting cars and seizing their drugs and cash in the name of the law.
If you're trying to steal drugs off drug gangs, which is what he was doing, probably the best thing to be is a guy in uniform, police badge, police warrant card, showing who you are. It's very difficult if you're stopped by a police officer to say, hang on a sec, is this really a police officer? Of course, we've seen cases since this one where people have pretended to be police officers with devastating effect.
On 7 different occasions over the next 5 months, between November 2019 and March 2020, PC Mahmood took marked police cars from Stoke Newington Police Station on days when he was signed off sick. He would then pull over drug dealers with the help of another man.
The man in the car with him wasn't even a police officer. It was his bodybuilder friend, Johan Gergel. He was wearing a police stab vest. Would he be stopping these people in his uniform?
Yeah, he was stopping people in his uniform, and he also had Irwan with him, his friend, who was dressed up like in a pseudo uniform, in a stab vest, and he would be with him like a big bodybuilder, like Protection Romanian guy, and that was his associate. So when he stopped people to take the drug money, doing a stop and search, then obviously they're not going to say, this cop stopped me and took my drugs money, so he got away with the money.
They made unlawful stop and searches on these drug dealers and stole hundreds of thousands in cash.
So when the drug dealers had sold the drugs, they knew where the money was going to be. And what happened then, they stopped those individuals and took the drugs money away from them. So therefore, not only do they have the money, they could also keep the drugs and also keep the money.
I think a lot of criminals realise something about crime, the obvious thing, that you can become quite rich quite quickly. I think he probably thought, I'll put some money into the family, I'll do this for a bit, I'll get away with it, I won't get caught, and then I'll stop. Of course, greed never ends, and that's what I think a lot of criminals find hard to fight with.
The corrupt scheme was working like a charm. But how was Mahmood able to use a police car without his colleagues knowing, especially when he was meant to be on sick leave?
He was actually taking out police cars. What do we know from that? Does that mean it's quite easy to do what he did?
Well, take a look at this police station. It's heavily guarded. I know I've been actually out with police from this police station in their police cars. Once you're inside those gates, which you need a warrant card or ID card to get into a police station to get the other side, you've pretty much got free range. And quite clearly, the police were not checking who were taking cars out. He was using other people's names. He was signing cars out when he was off sick, for example, or not on duty. So he must have been walking through the corridors of the police station, past people who perhaps knew that he wasn't supposed to be there, but nobody spotted it. Something the police will have to look at, I think.
And Mahmood and his fake cop friend Gergel were raking it in. The bogus stop and searches were lifting hundreds of thousands of pounds from rival gangs.
And I think what is interesting is that none of the people he robbed thought, hang on a sec, this police officer has stopped me, he's searched my vehicle, he's asked me what I'm doing, presumably, he's found some money, he may have found some drugs, but he hasn't arrested me. What's going on here? And I think if they thought about it for a few minutes, they might have realised that this might be a scam. But of course, they too are criminals, so they can't really report it.
Exactly, they hang themselves if they report it as well.
Relying on the fact that criminals won't come forward or speak out, Mahmood carried on with his robberies.
He was taking money away from those young people who were like runners. The consequences, when you don't deliver the goods and money to the person who's bought the drugs, your masters, then consequences are immense.
People lower down the ladder, going back saying, we've had it taken off us, everything's gone, and they probably got something happening to them for that.
Well, that's right.
All seemed to be going well for Kashif Mahmood and the gang he was working for. All until they pulled over the wrong car at the wrong time.
It all starts to go wrong on the 8th of March 2020. Mahmood comes to the police station, even though he's off sick. He takes a police car out in somebody else's name. He drives to Chingford, which is not his patch. He shouldn't be there, certainly not in a police car, because he knows that there's going to be a deal taking place in a residential street. So what happened was the drug dealer is there. One of the Khan brothers turns up in his car. He gets in the drug courier's car, hands over £400,000. He then leaves. They then wait a few seconds, and suddenly the police car turns up. Mahmood comes along, he parks next to that car, he gets out, he pretends to search it. He takes the money, he drives off.
But this was the point at which Kashif Mahmood's luck ran out.
The problem was that across the street, there was another police unit. That police unit was an anti-money laundering unit that was doing an undercover investigation. They were watching the drug courier. They thought, what the hell's going on here? They actually stopped Mahmood and asked him why he had stopped and searched the car. He told them that he smelt cannabis on the driver's breath, that he thought perhaps there was something going on. There'd been a couple of bags in the car, but nothing else.
Mahmood had lied to his fellow officers. Unbeknownst to them, he had in fact taken a huge stash of money.
The undercover unit wanted to know a bit more, so they said, would you mind filling out an intelligence report? So Mahmood goes back to his police station late at night. He then writes up his report and thinks he's got away with it.
Mahmood may have felt safe, but he was anything but. You know those criminals that would never report being robbed? Well, one of them walked into a police station and made some pretty extraordinary claims about what Mahmood had been up to.
How would they prove that somebody who had legitimate reason to take it, like a police officer, is the person who actually stopped them and took the money? How are they, the person who was a courier, going to prove that? If I was a drug dealer, I was a kingpin, I'd be thinking, you're trying to pull one on me. You got the money for yourself, so you best sort it out. And even if you do, I'm going to make sure that, for example, to others, it doesn't happen. So they would have been petrified. And maybe that's why that one went in a black Range Rover and actually reported it, because he probably thought, I've got to do this.
So we have this confession from a drugs courier who voluntarily came forward, and a report made by the police unit who had seen Mahmood conduct a stop and search on a car with no probable cause. He's now starting to look very suspicious.
You can imagine at the time, those money laundering officers wondered why did he have to pull over that vehicle? They've got under surveillance. And then finding out later that he was off sick, alarm bells were ringing that he's a wrong un, he's involved in criminality.
And from that moment then, is this just where it spirals out of everything that he's been doing?
As a result of that stop and search, the Anti-Corruption Command got involved and they started looking at him and investigating him, and then realised that Mahmood was looking and researching the Azmand so far back as 2019. They knew then that they were associates and they were onto something.
Anti-corruption investigators believed Mahmood was feeding this information gained directly from the police computers back to Niesmond in Dubai. But this wasn't the only smoking gun that police discovered, as they secretly built a case against their own officer.
Yeah, that one picture has him banged to rights.
In early 2020, Metropolitan Police Officer Kashif Mahmood was being secretly investigated for stealing money for a criminal gang based out of Dubai. Unbeknownst to him, the investigators already had incriminating evidence provided by his own police body cam.
We've got an image here.
Yes, that's obviously him getting into the vehicle, and that's his co-pilot, his cohort there, sitting in the front passenger seat.
When Mahmood and his fake cop friend Johan Gergel performed an illegal stop and search on a drug dealer's car in order to steal their money, he failed to notice his police body cam was triggered, catching some very incriminating evidence, showing that the man accompanying Mahmood was in fact not a police officer at all.
So, in evidence, he's not a police officer.
No.
And they know that, so they're going to go, why has he got a police issue?
Exactly. The stab vest he's wearing, it. He looks, to all intents and purposes, like a police officer. Yeah?
Yeah.
And obviously, Mahmood knows about that. And off they're going to go to take money off of someone else.
So he doesn't know his body cam's recording at this point. This is what I'm saying. He's hung himself with this evidence because you can't explain that away. Is there no way of deleting what your body cam records?
No. Because if that's the case, then police officers who are corrupt would have a means of being able to say, I've attacked you, I've done whatever, and I know how to get rid of it. So it's kept somewhere completely remote from it. Even though you have it, you can't actually stop what's happening.
Wow, that one picture has him banged to rights.
Blissfully unaware that he's being investigated, Mahmood continued his illegal raids on rival drug couriers.
With intelligence sent from the gang's network in Dubai, Mahmood is using his powers as a police officer to steal hundreds of thousands in drug money from rival gangs.
This is despite the fact that fellow Met officers had already questioned him about a previous stop he had made on a drug courier's car in Essex on the 8th of March 2020.
He doesn't stop after that incident in Chingford. And I get the impression that at this point, his controller in Dubai, Niesman, is really seeing the opportunity to make a lot of money. So he's getting instructions from Niesman, who's in Dubai, via the EncroChat messages. And he tells Mahmood to get into work, even though he's on sick leave, pick up a car and head this time for Wembley, where there's another courier who's moving around with some drugs in a van. And he sends him another message. He says, bro, be normal. Don't be cocky, because the police aren't cocky when they stop people. He says, and make sure you search that van for more money. He says, it's got to be 500K to 1 million, bro. A lot of money expected in that van. And so sure enough, and we don't have too many details on this, Mahmood drives up to Wembley, stops this guy, pretends to search him, the same old trick, takes the money and heads back into London. Job done.
So, yet again, Mahmood books out a vehicle, meets up with his cohort, Gergel, and they head off in the direction of Wembley. 90 miles per hour plus, they head towards Wembley, where they go to a venue and they then steal at least £450,000 in cash.
450,000?
A lot of money.
On the 25th of March 2020, Mahmood and his accomplice stole £450,000 from a courier. It was the proceeds of selling drugs.
Though Mahmood is now operating like a seasoned criminal, he wasn't always like this. So I've asked psychologist Serena Simmons to help me understand why a decorated cop who has a wife and family would turn to criminality.
We know that Mahmood grew up in a bit of a rough area, and I think he was sort of trying to be brought into a gang and didn't want to do that. What's it like for people that are growing up in an area where, you know, there is gangs and there's that temptation?
I think the word temptation is spot on. I think it's really tempting for someone just to follow suit when they're growing up in that area because that's their norm. I think the sad thing with this particular case is we know that Mahmood had resistance to that. So I think he saw something and he thought, I don't want to be like that. So early on we see signs that he wanted to kind of rebut that trend and not go down the same path that maybe he'd seen other people in his community go down.
Yeah, and he actually got stabbed because he didn't want to join the gang, and still he stayed on the right path.
Yeah, he really resisted that. He must have worked incredibly hard, because you imagine how much kind of self-talk he had to do to think, no, I'm not going to fall for that. I'm not going to do what these other people are doing.
But he did end up snapping in May 2017, when he assaulted a member of the public whilst on duty.
He doesn't lose his job. He continues on as a police officer. Do you think that could have been a turning point?
I wonder whether it was just a series of kind of puzzle pieces that fell into place, meeting particular people, having particular conversations, being around criminals and within kind of that kind of group of people wasn't unusual for him. He'd been raised in a deprived area among gangs, and so maybe he was used to having conversations with people like that, and it was those conversations that started to present themselves, and from there maybe that's when a plan started to form.
March 2020, and Kashif Mahmood has no idea investigators are building a case against him, and they're getting help from police in Europe, who are decrypting the messages to Mahmood from the criminal mastermind of the gang, Mujtaba Niesmond, based in Dubai.
When the European police realised that criminals all over Europe were using a system called EncroChat to talk to each other, and they ended up, the French police, breaking in digitally to the system and placing a digital device, a bit of code in the system, so that they could record effectively the texts that were coming through the whole network. And that was the biggest breakthrough, I think, in policing against serious organised crime in recent times. These criminals thought the police could not be watching them, but the police were in effect looking over their shoulders, reading every single text.
Mahmood and his gang, like most global organised criminals, had been writing and sending messages using EncroChat without fear of them being read by the authorities.
It was so crucial when the police were able to hack into EncroChat, and they managed to identify 6,500 criminals and organised gangs, you know, drug importation, serious crime. Then you've got this organised gang over here, and they were looking at the messages, and that was good intelligence to lead them to Mahmood.
And that was literally the nail in Mahmood's coffin. The Met was closing in on Mahmood, and at 2:40 in the morning on the 28th of April 2020, police arrived at his and his wife Shireen's home in Essex with a search warrant.
The police were reasonably satisfied that they had sufficient evidence, so they went to the address of Mahmood and he was arrested. But before the officers were able to enter the premises, Mahmood had directed his wife to remove a box. The disturbing thing about that is that Mahmood's wife, Shireen, was also a police officer.
His wife's a police officer?
She's a police officer.
If you're a police officer breaking the law, it's quite handy if you've got another police officer in the family, and he did. His wife was a police officer in a different part of London, a different borough command unit, as it's called, and she came in very handy, because eventually Mahmood works out that he's likely to get raided by the police. He tells his wife, and just before the raid, she manages to hide a shoebox containing some amount of money and some watches, because she knows where the police are likely to look when they do a search.
Through the messages they had decrypted on EncroChat, the police had found out about the money Mahmood had illegally seized, but to this day haven't discovered the cash.
And that shoebox was never found. The judge thought there might actually have been something like £100,000 in that shoebox.
By asking his wife to hide the money, Mahmood had made her an accomplice.
I think that when push came to shove and he was finally caught, I think it would have created sheer panic in him. Not only because of what he'd done, he was now losing status. He'd also involved his family, he'd involved his wife, and I think we see that sense of panic in terms of how he then responded when he was eventually arrested.
Whilst in custody, Mahmood was made aware of his friend Johan Gergel's starring role in the body cam footage that was accidentally turned on during one of the robberies, and revealed he was travelling with a fake cop.
Every criminal makes a mistake like this. And in this case, he probably didn't even know that he'd sat in his car, he'd actually triggered the camera that's worn on the chest, that has quite an easy button to operate, and presumably he turned at some point to the guy next to him in the car, and that guy was Johan Gergel, who wasn't a police officer, he was wearing his wife's police gear, and that really gave the game away, because if he's saying, well, look, I'm working as a police officer, I'm out in my police car, that's my defence, I just happen to turn my camera on, well, who's this guy sat next to him? He's not a police officer, and that is a severely bad situation for him, all by chance.
Johan Gergel was arrested in Stratford on the same day as Mahmoud. A search of his address revealed a Met stab vest and more than £11,000 in cash. But Mahmoud and his associates had taken a lot more than that.
I still want to know what happened to all that money that was stolen and whether the international crime gang he was working with was brought to justice.
April 2020. PC Kashif Mahmoud has been arrested for his part in a conspiracy to steal large amounts of cash from drug dealers on the streets of London. The criminal's communications via an encrypted app had been intercepted by police, and now they came to search his house.
Investigators found expensive designer watches at his home, and over £40,000 had been put into his family's bank account. His time for playing both sides of the law was over.
During the search, the officers came across at least 3 Rolex watches. One was valued at somewhere in the region of £7,000, and they subsequently found out that he'd actually paid £6,000 cash as part of that deposit. Now, I'm not sure that there are too many police officers, with the greatest respect, are able to pay £6,000 in cash for a watch.
When I was a police officer, I certainly couldn't afford a £6,000 watch. This watch here is 80 quid.
Mahmoud's accomplice, Johan Gergel, who had joined him on the raids and pretended to be a police officer, was also arrested. As was Gergel's wife, Inga, who actually was a trainee police officer and whose police issue stab vest he was wearing.
Wait, there's how many? So there's 3 police officers involved in this now?
So Inga, Erwan's wife, the point was with her, she's got her husband coming home wearing a stab-proof vest. She's a serving officer. Doesn't matter if she's a trainee, but he was wearing a stab-proof vest coming home, and that was hanging up in the house, and she didn't know anything about it. Ridiculous.
Wow.
She ended up being dismissed from the police.
So she was done for basically lying, because they said there's no way that money could have been there. Those items could have been in the property, and she didn't see it.
Yeah, well, you'd notice if your partner's walking around in a police issue stab vest.
Exactly.
Though Inga was dismissed from the force, she escaped prosecution. But whilst Mahmoud and Gergel were in police custody, there was just one last push to get the UK leaders of the gang, the Khan brothers. They were the middlemen from East London who'd made the all-important connection between Mahmoud and Niesmond out in Dubai.
They would have had intelligence which would have meant that they had to arrest the 3 Khan brothers.
On the 7th of July, evidence seized from the addresses linked to the Khans included £140,000 in cash, more than 20 kilograms of cannabis, and a box for an encrypted mobile phone.
So there were lots of moving parts and lots of things that the inquiry team would have to delve into. But the encrypt messaging platform was going to be the vehicle from which they would be able to produce the evidence to convict them subsequently.
The Khan brothers could now be picked up, and the EncroChat messages between the brothers and Niesmond also incriminated Mahmoud's wife, Shireen.
The EncroChat showed that at some point there was a discussion between Niesmond and others about getting rid of the box with the papers in it.
That paper is referring to cash.
And it implied that Mahmoud's wife, Shireen, had actually disposed of that box. So the officers would then have had to arrest her as well.
When Shireen Kashif eventually went to court, she was spared a major sentence.
Jareen was convicted of money laundering offences. She received a sentence of 2 years imprisonment, suspended for 21 months, with 150 hours of community service order. And obviously, she was shamed and struck off from being a police officer and dismissed.
Her husband, PC Mahmood, was in much deeper trouble. And with overwhelming evidence against him, including his own body cam footage, there was no talking his way out of it. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to acquire criminal property and misconduct in public office, avoiding the need for a trial, in return for a shorter sentence.
This is an interesting case from a police's point of view. They didn't have everything on a plate. They had to really work for it. But I think this story of this guy going out and stealing from the people who sell drugs, and he's working for a drugs gang at the same time, was really compelling. It was a bit like a crime drama in itself.
His lawyer said his remorse was genuine and he didn't realise the extent of the gang's criminal activity. And he claimed he never took a cut of any money seized.
Lots of criminals are remorseful because they've been caught. I think for Mahmood, it's a double-edged sword. I think it's bittersweet in that he was crying for himself. He hadn't gained what he wanted to gain, which I think he was aiming for, basically attaining a certain amount of money in a particular lifestyle. And then I wonder whether he would have stopped.
There was no doubt that by turning to criminality, Mahmood was getting a lot more cash and a much wealthier lifestyle than he had when he was living off just a police wage. So was his motive that simple?
I think, again, greed is at the heart of this. He wanted to live, he wanted to portray a particular lifestyle to people, so any risk was worth taking. Something would have triggered his thoughts around now there being another avenue, another way of being. Was it that he started to become privy to the lifestyle that other people were having as a result of criminal activity? For me, when you look at Mahmood, there's something very deep-seated there in terms of him becoming very attached to the status that being a police officer brought for him. So police are essentially in a position of power and authority, and that comes with some kind of reverence in society. At the same time, showing that you live a particular lifestyle, an affluent lifestyle, showing that you have materialistic goods at your disposal, also highlights a similar status.
We'll never know if Mahmood would have eventually come to his senses and stopped his criminality, or even whether this decorated officer will ever admit why he threw it all away.
What was the reasons you think he got involved? Was it financial gain for himself? Was it leaned on by criminals himself?
Well, there's nothing to suggest, ultimately, when Kashif is at court, where he says anything like that. He doesn't say, you know, they were blackmailing me, they were threatening me, or doing anything like that. He doesn't take that route, because he actually pleads beforehand. So he's accepting what the charge is. So there's nothing to suggest that he was leaned on by anyone. I just think he saw the flamboyant lifestyle that they lived around him, that he thought, well, I want a piece of that action. He was living the dream.
The gang was sentenced to a total of 60 years for their role in the robberies and for supplying drugs.
On the 13th of May 2021 at Southwark Crown Court, ex-Metropolitan Police Officer Kashif Mahmood was sentenced to 8 years in prison, reduced from 12 years for pleading guilty and preventing a trial.
How does it make you feel when you have one of your own mixing with criminals like this and getting 8 years?
Well, for a start, he's never one of mine now. And the fact he's a criminal who was engaging with organised criminals, he has absolutely violated the trust that he had. What he's done, he's ruined the reputation, not only, you know, of himself, but other officers who every day are out there putting their life on the line, and he does this, and we all get tarred. 8 years is not long enough for him.
So what was the fallout from a corrupt cop committing such criminal acts whilst working in the Metropolitan Police?
Is there any sympathy for Mahmood in this case?
You can be sure that inside that police station, there won't be any sympathy for him. There's nothing the police hate more than a bad cop. The Met has a lot of problems at the moment. Trust in the Met and the police has plummeted in this city, and the last thing they need is a dodgy cop.
One thing I want to know is what became of the puppet master out in Dubai, Mujtaba Niazmand.
Although Mujtaba Niazmand was mentioned in the criminal proceedings, he has never been brought to justice and has never been arrested. We know that Niazmand has never been found.
But for now, this was a win for the police, weeding out a corrupt cop.
We talk a lot about cops gone bad, and in terms of Mahmoud, I think we can safely say he fits that bill 100%. He was obviously a confident individual who felt that he wouldn't be caught.
It could have been in many ways the perfect crime.
And then end up getting caught, obviously.
Crime never pays.
The attraction of easy money clearly played a part in Mahmoud being involved with an international drugs gang. I mean, he's a police officer and he tried to escape his past. It's just greed got the better of him. Catching criminals is no easy job.
Making it to arrest you.
But it's even harder when the criminal is a cop turned bad.
He liked having power and authority and status and a uniform.
When the police officers who were sworn to protect us turned to rape.
She was actually meeting a monster.
Murder.
What happened in those minutes or moments or seconds where he chose to go and get a weapon?
Robbery.
He knows where the money is, he knows where the drugs are.
And even blackmail and poisoning. All just to get what they want.
In this series, I'm enlisting the help of 3 experts.
That man should stay behind bars for the rest of his life.
2 senior officers who've put hundreds of offenders behind bars.
He was in such a lofty position that he thought he was untouchable.
And a psychologist who can analyse the criminal mind.
He's a narcissist. He doesn't feel remorse.
In this series, I'll be investigating why some cops put themselves on the wrong side of the law, abuse their power, and commit horrific crime. This is a story of a police officer who was so well thought of, he was trusted to guard the royal family.
Hidden from public view, this royal protection officer led a double life, entangled in a world of firearms and illicit encounters with sex workers.
And his loving wife had no idea what was going on until she got in the way.
What follows is a shocking tale which ends in the ultimate crime. On the afternoon of the 10th of January 1997, Patricia Coulton went to work as normal at a care home in Berkshire. Aged 52, with 2 grown-up children, Patricia was a trusted care worker at the Linwood Nursing Home in Sunningdale.
Meanwhile, her husband, Michael Coulton, was on shift guarding the royal family here at one of the most famous buildings in the country, Buckingham Palace.
And that's where I'm meeting Caroline Kerr, a journalist who covered this case.
What do we know happened on January 10th?
Patricia was a care assistant. She worked locally and was going in to do a late shift. What we know about her day is that she went to a travel agent's on the way and she booked a 2-week holiday, and her colleague said that she was in very good humour that day because she was quite excited about the holiday.
So on that night, Patricia just leaves work from the nursing home as normal?
Yeah, she leaves at about 10 o'clock, which is her usual time, and gets into her car, and a friend sees her getting into the car, but within about a minute, the car cuts out.
Meanwhile, on that cold January night, Michael Coulton finished his shift at the Royal Palace and went home. By 11:15 p.m, there was no sign of his wife, so he raised the alarm and called the police. Former Detective Chief Superintendent Sue Hill has led investigations into many serious crimes and has agreed to help me unravel what happened after the police went looking for Patricia Coulton.
Now, in this case, the husband is reported her missing. You know, he's shocked, he's devastated, he's grieving.
But it didn't take long for Patricia to be discovered, as she hadn't made it far from the care home. So, when was she actually found?
So she was found the next day. A dog walker found her. She was still in the vehicle, blood all over her, beaten, stabbed, and her body was halfway out of the vehicle. Just a horrendous scene.
Police rushed to the crime scene.
When the police arrive at the scene and they find what they find, what do they think's happened?
I think initially they just don't know. She was stabbed 15 times in the car, and some people locally heard screams, but they thought it was foxes. So at that point, she is being murdered and nobody comes to her rescue. It's a very, very violent attack, but at this point, they don't know why it's occurred.
Detectives started their methodical investigation by locking down the area and searching for vital clues. So at that stage, what would you be looking for?
First of all, you secure the forensics, make sure nothing's taken into scene, nothing's taken away. That is your crime scene. And then what you do, you need witnesses. Did anyone know anything? Despite what you see in the media, random murders and attacks on women are very, very rare. So you'd be looking at the neighbours, maybe talking to work colleagues, and then you'd start building a picture and piecing together the jigsaw. We need to find a motive. You know, why would anyone want to kill Patricia? Why?
As police secured the scene, they began sifting evidence and speaking to witnesses. The people at the care home had started to try and process their loss.
It's dreadful, awful shock. She was lovely. All I can say is I didn't know her closely. I knew her as a carer, and as far as the carers are concerned, they're all lovely.
Whilst those who knew Patricia at work were being spoken to, other detectives had the task of speaking to her now widowed husband, Michael. So, what do we know about Michael Coulton?
Well, Michael Coulton, he joined the Met Police in the 70s. Just a straightforward response driver when he joined, just an everyday kind of guy. He was married and he had 2 children, and his wife Patricia, they appeared to all intents and purposes a happily married couple.
Is it true, though, that he had quite a high-end job?
He was deployed on royalty protection. He would stand outside the palace and he would be outside Windsor Castle. So basically, he would have been armed. He'd be on fixed points, static points, and making sure he's protecting royalty, diplomats, you know, politicians.
To me, that sounds quite prestigious. You must have to go through some sort of training to carry a gun, you know?
Well, to carry a gun, you have to go through a selection process, psychometric testing. You know, they just don't issue a firearm to everyone. So he would have been vetted, he would have been selected, he'd been gone through an interview process to make sure that he's got the right attributes to be able to carry a gun and be physically fit and actually have the authority and the ability to protect our royal family.
So, an all-round good cop, respected?
Yes.
Michael Coulton, a devoted officer who took great pride in his work, faced a significant test early in his police career.
I think it's interesting with Michael Coulton that in 1976 he was at Notting Hill Carnival and he got badly stabbed. And he was off sick for 12 months.
It was during this sick leave that the cracks started to show in his marriage to Patricia. And by the early 1980s, it seemed Coulton was beginning to find solace elsewhere. So we know there's issues in his marriage. What happens after that?
He was having an affair with a next-door neighbour, and he even talked to the next-door neighbour about how he was in this unhappy relationship with his wife Patricia, and how sex was boring, how he didn't want to be with her. And really, poor Patricia was completely blindsided. She had no idea. She thought she was happily married, in a nice relationship, and eventually he split up with Patricia.
In 1983, the couple separated and divorced. But very unusually, they came back together again just 3 years later. To help me understand their relationship dynamic, I've come to speak to psychologist Serena Simmons.
When you see men rebound and keep going back to a previous partner, I think how we kind of try and make sense of that is to think about it from an attachment perspective. So men like him often need that secure attachment figure, and they don't feel very strong without them. So just like a baby when they're growing up, they need to keep knowing that their mum's there and kind of keep looking back to know that they have that secure attachment. So she served a purpose. Often men who have those multiple affairs are only good at having the affair, as in they still need a woman at home to make them feel good on a daily basis. But when that's gone, their attachment kind of crumbles. They don't have this secure figure anymore, which renders them quite weak.
Despite the Coultons reuniting in 1986, a shocking revelation emerged. Michael had laid bare his dark thoughts about Patricia to the woman he was having an affair with.
So he was having an affair with a neighbour. Now, this neighbour recalls that he used to say things to her about Patricia, his wife, how he wished that he could drown her in the bath, or he had visions of electrocuting her, or talking about cutting her brakes. So already he was talking about how to get rid of his wife.
So knowing all what the neighbour knows, she knows that the wife's in danger.
Well, you would have thought so. However, I imagine when they're in that kind of extramarital relationship, she's probably thinking he's just saying that as bravado because he wanted to carry on with the relationship with her, making that more important than what it was.
Although that first affair was in the 1980s and Michael and Patricia did get back together and eventually remarry in 1995, I couldn't help thinking that those conversations about killing his wife had to mean something.
He was obviously taking time to think about what he could do to her to get rid of her, and he verbalised that to someone. I think he verbalised that to someone that he felt safe with, and that's why he said it. So that was like a little bit of leakage on his part. He was letting something go there.
Do you think she took it like with a pinch of salt, what he was saying about what he was doing to his wife, rather than take him seriously?
So I don't think we ever know that someone actually is serious, but that should be a red flag to anyone. If someone is talking about killing a partner, that's not something that you say in jest, and certainly if he'd been doing it on repeat, that would be a red flag for anyone, I think.
But at this stage in the investigation, all detectives knew was that Patricia Coulton had been killed in a frenzied knife attack. They had no concrete evidence which might lead them to the identity of her killer.
Michael Coulton was a police officer trusted to guard the royal family. But just what did happen to his wife Patricia after he left his shift at Buckingham Palace on January the 10th, 1997?
Dreadful. Awful shock. She was lovely. All I can say is I didn't know her closely. I knew her as a carer.
Patricia's body was discovered lying across the doorway of her car, left lifeless in the grounds of the care home where she worked in Sunningdale, Berkshire.
She was stabbed 15 times in the car, and some people locally heard screams. There's no evidence of any kind of sexual assault, there's no evidence of any robbery. It's a very, very violent attack, but at this point, they don't know why it's occurred.
5 days after Patricia's murder, on January the 15th, 1997, police decided to revisit those closest to her, including her husband, Michael Coulton, a Metropolitan Police Royal Protection Officer. To help me understand the workings of a murder investigation, I've come to see Howard Groves, a former Met detective with decades of experience in serious crime cases.
They go and visit him at home. He appears to be the distraught husband.
Even though he's treated as a victim and he would have had the support of a family liaison officer, they would have gone and searched his home. That's just standard procedure. They carried out the search and they recovered numerous prohibited weapons. For instance, there was a shotgun that had been given to him by Princess Alexandra's chauffeur. He had shortened the barrel of that, and he'd actually made it what we describe as a .38 handgun. These are all prohibited items, and he would have known that.
Clearly unnerved by the search of his home by police colleagues, Coulton began behaving erratically.
Michael Coulton panicked as he was arrested during what was supposed to have been just a routine search. He grabbed this pump-action shotgun and threatened the arresting officer.
What would happen in that situation?
Those officers would have just turned up to conducting inquiries in relation to the murder of his wife, so they wouldn't have had firearms. So they would have been surprised, one, by the firearms being on open display, and two, him then threatening them with it.
I wanted to know what kind of man would keep so many illegal firearms at his home.
He kept weapons because it gave him a sense of authority. Also, quite confusingly, probably safety. He felt safe for having those. And I don't mean that in the way that someone might keep a firearm in their home for safety to protect himself, but he wanted to again feel powerful and safe because he was the most important person in his life. He did everything because of his own egocentricity. So he wanted to feel powerful, he wanted to feel in control, he wanted to know that no one could hurt him. And I think that that's exhibited in the fact that when his home was actually searched, he did panic and he tried to hide the firearms and particularly paperwork in the boot of his car. And when it came close to people realising that those things were there, he grabbed the shotgun and started to threaten one of the officers that was searching the property.
On the 17th of January 1997, just 7 days after his wife's murder, Michael Coulton is suspended from duty by the Metropolitan Police after admitting 4 firearms offences.
Royal Protection Squad policeman Michael Coulton, whose wife Pat was murdered a week ago, appeared before magistrates in Reading today on firearms charges.
He was released on conditional bail a few days later, on the 24th of January 1997. His wife's dead, so surely for a copper that's like red flags here. You know, he's got all these guns he's not supposed to have, and we just told him his wife's dead and he's threatening police.
Oh, totally. To me, he's kind of lost the plot. However, all well and good, you can think he's a wrong un, he's done it, but actually there was no evidence. There was no association. At that stage, got no forensic evidence, no witnesses. He was at home, okay, he's got firearms illegally, but that does not make him a murderer because the method was stabbing and those firearms weren't related to the murder.
Meanwhile, at the care home in Sunningdale where Patricia worked and her body was found, the search was still on for the weapon that was used to murder her.
They would have done a fine tooth comb search of the area to see if they could have retrieved the weapon. That wasn't found. They did take samples of soil. They found a footmark in the snow, so that was photographed, that was lifted and taken away. And those things are kept to see what is subsequently found to support that.
As police forensics continued to work the scene, other officers canvassed the area in the hope they might start to get answers.
We're investigating an incident which took place here in this area last week.
The line of inquiry would be, was it a robbery? But it was obvious to them that her handbag was still there, her phone was there, her rape alarm was still there. So that would create a dilemma for the officers as to, so why was she attacked? What was the motive? So the initial process would be for the police to do a public appeal because they had no idea as to who killed her and the motive. So the press appeal would have been the normal course of action.
I am determined, as is Thames Valley Police, that we will do all we can to catch the killer of Pat Coulton in such tragic circumstances so that the old people in this home can start to live their lives without the fear that hangs over them at the moment.
Their hard work finally paid off when a witness came forward to tell the police they'd seen a blue Morris Ital car driving from the murder scene at the time of the killing. As police pressed on probing everyone in Patricia's circle, a woman came forward with even more startling revelations about royal cop Michael Coulton.
Diana Bridges, who was his former neighbour, he went to visit her the day after Patricia's death and asked her not to speak to the police. And it had the opposite effect on her. It made her feel obviously quite suspicious of him, and she went to the police. And that was the first time, I think, that they had an insight into his true character.
Diana described Coulton as being obsessed with her.
He starts becoming a bit stalkerish and obsessing over her. And although they didn't have a relationship, he was following her, he was watching her, and she felt really uncomfortable. And he ended up stealing some photographs of her. He just was acting really weirdly and obsessive about her.
This behaviour isn't what you would expect from someone who carries a gun and is entrusted to guard and protect royalty. So what was going on in Coulton's head?
I think that Diana was clearly aware of the kind of character that he was. He was essentially stalking her, and she asked him very clearly to not have anything to do with her. So when his wife died, I think it was very easy for her to put two and two together because she knew his character, and so she felt compelled to stand up and go forward and tell the police what she knew. And that was very brave on her part, because really she may not have been able to make any distinct links, but there was enough for her to feel unsure. There was enough for her to want to call this person out and draw attention to him and draw attention to the character that he had.
A picture was building of Coulton's secret life, but police still had no evidence. Not until they discovered the car that witnesses had placed at Patricia's murder scene.
So during the course of the police inquiries, they find a burnt-out blue Morris Ital. Now, initially, those officers would have done inquiries based on the numbers in the engine and identified it as belonging to somebody called P. Johnson. So that would not have had any information to link it to Coulton at that point.
Undeterred, police pressed on with further testing. Detailed forensics were done on the car to see if there was any DNA or mineral traces connecting the vehicle with the murder scene. So what happened next in the investigation?
There was soil on that car, in that vehicle, that was associated at the scene of Patricia's death.
Right.
So then you've got a forensic link. So whoever was driving that Morris is a very good suspect.
Paul Johnston was the name given as a registered keeper of the vehicle, but police had no luck tracing him, leaving it as a dead end for detectives. So now, the focus of the investigation moved back into Coulton's private life, and it was soon discovered that he had been using massage parlours and seeing sex workers on a regular basis.
As a result of the difficulties in his relationship, he decided that he would have a relationship with sex workers that would visit his address when his wife was at work. So there was an awful lot that was going on. He was living a chaotic and a really strange life.
I think seeing sex workers was safe for him. I don't think in reality he was probably very confident, front-facing. So I think seeking relationships essentially with sex workers was a safe bet for him. It meant that he could pay for their services, they had to spend time with him, because we know that he wasn't that confident in actually seeking the genuine attention of people.
So, Coulton, a police officer who guarded Buckingham Palace, was visiting sex workers. And it turns out one of these women had a key piece of information that would crack this case wide open.
Michael Coulton was leading a double life, sleeping with sex workers and keeping illegal firearms in his home.
But he had a much bigger secret, and police were closing in.
A burnt-out car had been discovered that witnesses placed at the scene of his wife Patricia Coulton's murder on the 10th of January 1997.
The breakthrough moment would have been the recovery of that vehicle, and therefore the next part of the investigation would be a forensic search of that vehicle. And during the forensication, they identified that there was soil inside the vehicle, which was similar to that in the orchard where Patricia had been killed. The vehicle was registered in a completely different name.
The name the burnt-out car was registered in was Paul Johnston. By the 27th of February 1997, 318 witness statements had been taken, and a total of 1,823 separate police inquiries. But despite their best efforts, a team of 28 officers and civilian police staff involved in the hunt for Patricia's killer could find no trace of Johnston. The investigation moved forward with their next best lead, Coulton's personal life. They discovered he had a close relationship with a sex worker known as Sherry.
He bought a car and kept it in a lockup and bought it under an alias so that it wouldn't be traced to him.
Coulton was making use of his extensive police knowledge to make sure he'd covered his tracks.
And he also wanted to be careful that no documentation came to his home. And he persuaded Sherry to allow him to use her address for that car documentation to come through to. And he told her some cock-a-bull story about it being police undercover work.
And guess which name Coulton gave on the paperwork for the car he kept at Sherry's address? Yep, Paul Johnston, the owner of the Morris Ital spotted leaving the scene of Patricia Coulton's murder.
Right, so obviously this is a burnt-out car.
No, this vehicle was registered in another name, but it was actually, he was the owner of this vehicle. It was just giving false details.
But how hard is it, though, if you find a burnt-out car, to forensically examine it and get all the details?
There are certain details in the engine block that they will be able to identify the serial number, and from that they can then trace the vehicle back to the owners or previous owners. So that's quite straightforward. The question is why was the vehicle burnt out in the first place? Because that would have been set alight somewhere. Somebody would have told police that there's a vehicle on fire. And initially they probably wouldn't know there was anything sinister with it. It's not until events that unfold later on that they would have then put this vehicle to be involved with him later on.
But Coulton has burnt that out thinking that covers me tracks.
Yeah, because when he gets to the scene in this vehicle and he leaves, if for some reason someone was walking their dog or doing something at that time of the morning and saw the vehicle and gave a description or a registration mark of the vehicle, it wouldn't come back to him. So he was thinking ahead, he was planning, and he then also makes sure he registered it in another person's name. So he was calculating in what he was doing, he was planning, and actually everything worked up to the point where she was killed, and then for the police officers to then investigate it and prove he was the person involved.
This was the evidence police were looking for. The car that Coulton owned was seen at the site of his wife's murder. And what's more, when police searched his home, they discovered yet more damning evidence. Then how would they know that Coulton was driving that car?
Because they found a pair of shoes, and on the shoes there was soil that matched the soil at the scene of the murder.
So he's kept the shoes that he wore when he murdered his wife?
Yeah, how ridiculous, schoolboy error.
He's not the brightest spark, is he?
Not really, keeping the shoes with the soil on from the crime scene. Yeah, he hasn't thought that one through.
On the 21st of April 1997, police arrested Michael Coulton for the murder of his wife, Patricia. The police had a growing pile of evidence against him. But there's one thing confusing me. On the night of Patricia's murder, how did Coulton know her car was going to break down?
This isn't that unusual because Patricia's experienced this on 2 previous occasions. And on both of those occasions, miraculously, her husband seems to be almost round the corner and is able to come very, very fast and fix the car.
So why is the car broke down before then?
What police came to realise was that he had constructed a remote-controlled device that could cut out the engine.
It was this black box which was the key to proving that Coulton was a killer. A remote control device found by police when they searched the garage of his family home in Woking. At first, they couldn't work out what it was.
I was just sat looking at it one day together with a diagram of the car's wiring, and it occurred to me that you may be able to plug the plug from the device into the car itself and thereby cause the thing to stop.
Michael Coulton's explanation of this remote control is it's used for a toy clan.
I'm sure the police must have tested it to see what it was for.
And then they tested it and knew he was using that to stall the vehicle.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Police tests reveal that the remote device was only able to turn things off, and the true use of the device was extremely devious.
We found the device itself had a range of only about 200 yards, but stood at the roadside. Once you operated the switch on the remote control device in your hand, that caused the switch under the bonnet of the car to operate, and the car then stopped about well, a matter of hundreds of yards along the road.
Detectives realised that the 2 previous times Patricia's car had cut out weren't by chance. None of it was.
Their belief is that he'd been trying this out on the 2 previous occasions, but on this occasion, it sparked the murder.
So he was obviously maybe doing dummy runs to see how far he needed to be away from the car, so he could use the remote to see if it worked before. And once he knew it worked, he knew the right spot to do it, and then on the night...
It could be that. It could be that on one occasion when it happened before, she was on the phone to her son when he appeared on the scene. So it could be that that scuppered a plan.
But on that night, 10th of January 1997, Coulton's diabolical plan would become a reality.
When it comes to the actual crime itself, what has he done?
Well, a lot of the stuff he'd done beforehand, you know, the device that he created, he had the vehicle stored somewhere else. It wasn't in his name, so he was planning to distance himself from it. On the day in question, he goes to work as normal. He then goes home. We know that his wife works and she finishes at about 10 o'clock at night. So he knew, because we're all creatures of habit, what time she's going to be at work, what time she's going to likely to be leaving. So he knew that between 10 o'clock or just before, he had to be in place. So he's driven the vehicle from the lockup to the venue where she works, placed himself in a position where he could use the remote to switch the engine off. She gets into the vehicle and drives off.
But Patricia only gets as far as the secluded orchard, a few hundred yards away from the care home.
So he would have been within the vicinity of the grounds to be able to then activate that on-off switch and switch the vehicle off. And at that point, he then attacks her and stabs her at least 15 times, as well as batters her across the head with an object, and she would have been dead at that point.
This is a man trusted with a firearm, protecting royalty, and he's obviously an absolute madman.
I don't necessarily agree with you. I think sometimes it's easy to say someone has to be mad for them to come up with such a heinous crime. It's just evil.
As the evidence continued to mount, the detectives found themselves bracing for the daunting responsibility of pressing charges against one of their own fellow officers.
First and foremost, you treat that officer just like a member of the public. You can't have in your mind who is a police officer, so we somehow need to treat them differently. One, the public would not expect that from us, and most police officers accept that. So he'd have been treated just like any other person who'd come through the door, been arrested for, whether it be a minor or a major offense, he'd have been treated the same way. They would have been disappointed because he's one of their own. So that's the only thing that they would reflect on, is how could that individual who's there to protect and serve can then attack someone so viciously.
And now his time had come.
Coulton was charged with his wife Patricia's murder, almost exactly 6 months after he killed her.
And in early October 1998, despite continuing to protest his innocence, Michael Coulton went on trial for the murder of his wife at Reading Crown Court.
Protection Squad policeman accused of murdering his wife has begun giving evidence. Michael Coulton told Reading Crown Court how he'd remarried the woman he's charged with murdering.
But I was still left asking myself,
what drove this seemingly successful married man and royal police officer to commit such a horrendous crime? Royal Protection Officer Michael Coulton is on trial for the murder of his wife Patricia.
The police found his burnt-out car registered under a false name, which contained soil, linking him to the scene of the crime, and the remote control in his garage that they believe was used to stop Patricia's car so he could attack her. At the trial, they were desperately trying to work out why he might commit murder. A question I was hoping psychologist Serena Simmons might have the answer to.
When it come to murdering his wife,
Was he living out a fantasy?
I think that he fantasised about being without his wife. I think he just didn't want her to exist anymore. He didn't want her to be there because he was fearful of rebounding back to her as he had done in the past. I think he fantasised about the life that he could have with the person that he was stalking. And I think he had deep fantasies about the fake relationship that he had with her. So in his mind, he needed to clear the way to get rid of his wife so that he could go and live this other life with this person that he'd been fantasising about for so long.
Would you, in your opinion, say he would have multiple personalities?
I don't think he had multiple personalities at all. I do think he was able to switch his persona and his character on and off depending on what setting he was in. He was possibly a good father because we know that his children, who have very, very sadly been affected by this as well, found it very difficult to give any evidence about their father. So we don't know maybe what he was like in other facets of his life, but we do know that he also held a lot of anger towards his wife, who ended up being the target, really. And that's very much expressed in how he went about killing her, which is incredibly sad.
It was down to detectives to supply the prosecution with evidence that Coulton did indeed commit such a heinous crime. I just don't understand how you go from loving your wife or being with your wife to stabbing her 15 times rather than just saying, this isn't working, we can't be together anymore. How does that happen?
Well, I think in his case it's greed. And bear in mind, she's a mother of 2 children.
Exactly.
But he'd already said previously to a neighbour that if she was dead, I'd have the house, which was worth about $160,000. When you think about it, her being dead gave him an opportunity to have a lot of money.
But that wasn't the only cash Coulton would stand to inherit if Patricia was out of the picture.
Can you see any other motive for wanting to kill his wife?
There was some suggestion that she had taken out life insurance, and that was somewhere in the region of about $100,000. So you could say that there was an ulterior motive, that if she died, he would then have that cash for himself and his children. But that's only speculation. That's never been proved as to the reason why. There's nothing to suggest he was in significant financial problems. And that's something the police would have looked at, because they'd have to look at the motive. Is there a financial reason why she's been killed, or is it just because he no longer wants a relationship with her and feels the only way he can get out of it, the sentence, is for her to be killed?
But throughout his trial, Coulton continued to refute the prosecution's evidence and claim his innocence.
Why would he plead not guilty? He could have got a shorter sentence if he pleaded guilty.
Most people in that position probably would have, but I think the reason why he hadn't done that is because his children, he knew he couldn't look them in the eye and admit that he'd killed their mother. So the only way he could deal with it is to let the trial run, plead not guilty. If he is found guilty by the jury, he could always say the jury got it wrong, and he could always convince them that it was someone else. He would never have done that. So I believe that's the reason why he didn't take the opportunity to get a lesser sentence by pleading, because he's then admitted that he's killed their mother. So for me, that tells you all you need to know. Is his fear of admitting, I've killed your mother. Imagine you having to tell your child or children that you've killed their mother. But would you bring yourself to do that?
I couldn't bring myself to kill him, but
exactly. So there you go.
The trial continued, and to get a better understanding of Patricia's last moments alive, the judge and the jury visited the care home in Berkshire where she was murdered.
This was an extraordinary day out from Reading Crown Court, as a coach arrived with a police escort. The jury had come to relive the last moments in the life of Patricia Coulton. The judge had expressly taken them to the grounds of Linwood Hospital in Sunningdale, where the prosecution alleged the Royal Protection Officer had driven from Buckingham Palace to this field and stabbed his wife 15 times before battering her about the head.
The trial lasted 5 weeks, and the jury took 9.5 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. Guilty.
The Justice Wright sentenced Coulton to life imprisonment and he told him, "The jury have found you guilty of what was quite plainly a long-planned, callous and utterly cold-hearted killing of your wife."
Life imprisonment in this case meant a minimum of 14 years locked up. Is that normal? Seems like not enough. I'm just saying that because if that was my mum, sister, daughter, I'd want him. Life is life.
I totally agree. And the thing is, you know, he's gone to prison. The two kids are on their own. And you think, why don't you just divorce her? You didn't need to kill her.
It's so sporadic. Sometimes you hear they get 30 years or life means life, you'll never come out of prison. He stabbed us 15 times. He's premeditated, he's planned it, he's told people he's going to do it. So it wasn't like he just snapped. Why? What's the difference?
I don't know. And also, I can say after 33 years and dealing with child protection, rapes, murders of kids, and when you see the impact on families, and it doesn't take one life away, it takes everyone's life away, because nothing is the same again.
And that's the truly devastating thing about this case. Patricia Coulton is not the only victim. It's the children who suffer the most, growing up without both their parents and forced to confront the appalling reality that one has killed the other.
I think this has been utterly devastating for the children, and I feel so incredibly sorry for them having to go through this, because not only have they lost their mum, but really they've lost their father as well. Even if you just consider the fact that they have to look at their father and know that he wasn't and isn't the person that they perceived him to be, and that's incredibly difficult for anyone to process. I think, sadly, he wasn't thinking of them in this. This was all very egocentric. It was all about him and his needs. He couldn't deal with real life.
The judge also told Coulton this was an appalling crime, made even more chilling by the fact that he was a police officer.
I would say he abused his knowledge in terms of how the investigators would look at that investigation. So he knew that he couldn't have a vehicle that was registered in his name. He had to find a lockup that he also was not linked to him. He knew that the officers would have examined the vehicle at the scene, so he had the device removed. So those are the things that, from a police knowledge, he was well aware of, and therefore tried to eliminate those bits of evidence to start with. But the investigators are just as shrewd, and they found the relevant bits of forensic, which obviously convicted him, because he did not make a confession.
The case of a trusted police officer committing such a barbaric crime will go down in notoriety.
This must have been a huge case at the time.
It was a scandal. It was such a scandal because this was a man who'd been trusted. I mean, on the very day that he murdered his wife, he'd been working here at Buckingham Palace, he'd been guarding the royal family, guarding the Queen, entrusted with that responsibility. And then he goes home and he stabs his wife 15 times and bludgeons her to death.
Without Michael Coulton admitting to what he has done, we will never know for sure why he did it.
I think how he went about killing his wife is very telling, because the act itself was extremely, extremely violent. I think he was angry with her. He was angry with her for, in his mind, constantly finding her way back into his life, and he blamed her for that. He was very much the kind of person that externalizes his problems. The problems he had in his life weren't his, it was because of other people. And so the fact that he was so violent in how he killed her, he didn't stab her once or twice, it was 15 times, and then bludgeoning her to death. So I think he was a very, very angry man, and I think a lot of that anger was sadly directed at his innocent wife.
To me, Michael Coulton loved the thrill of a double life. I mean, there was no love lost for his wife, yet he stayed with her. Why not just walk away, rather than stab an innocent woman to death? I suppose we'll never know.